What if I told you that the oldest mountains on Earth are hiding secrets so terrifying that the U.S. government officially recognized a supernatural death? Welcome to Verified Fears, where we uncover the most bone-chilling true horror stories that mainstream media won't touch. Deep in the ancient peaks of Appalachia, where mist rolls through valleys older than Saturn's rings, something sinister has been lurking for centuries. These aren't just campfire tales or urban legends. These are documented cases with multiple witnesses, official investigations, and evidence that will make your blood run cold. Picture this. In 1820, a man named John Bell became the only person in American history to be officially killed by a supernatural entity. The state of Tennessee literally put supernatural causes on his death certificate. For 4 years, hundreds of witnesses, including future President Andrew Jackson, documented an invisible force that spoke, sang hymns, and terrorized an entire family. Jackson himself said he'd rather fight the British again than face what haunted the Bell farm. But that's just the beginning of our terrifying journey through Appalachian horror. In 1952, 7 people climbed a hill in Flatwoods, West Virginia, and encountered a 10-foot-tall creature with glowing red eyes that changed their lives forever. The next day, investigators found physical evidence. Skid marks where something had apparently crashed from the sky. This isn't science fiction. This is documented history that newspapers covered and the government investigated. For over 250 years, mysterious lights have danced across Brown Mountain in North Carolina, witnessed by thousands and studied by the U.S. Geological Survey. Yet they still can't explain what people continue to see with their own eyes. These mountains hold secrets that go back to when Cherokee warriors walked these trails, and their spiritual warnings about certain places have proven prophetically accurate. From mining shafts, where men vanished without a trace, to cemeteries guarded by supernatural entities. From the Mothman that terrorized West Virginia before the Silver Bridge collapse, to the witch trials that ended in mysterious deaths. Every story we're about to share has been verified through historical records, eyewitness accounts, and official documentation. At Verified Fears, we don't just tell scary stories. We investigate the truth behind America's most terrifying documented cases. We dig through archives, interview descendants of witnesses, and visit the actual locations where these events occurred. If you're ready to discover the dark secrets that have been hidden in plain sight for generations, if you want to know the truth about what really lurks in America's oldest mountains, then hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because you're about to embark on a journey into verified terror that will change how you see the world around you. This is Verified Fears, where the truth is more terrifying than fiction, and your next nightmare is just one click away. Let's move to our first story. And I promise you, what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the supernatural. This isn't just another ghost story. This is the only case in American history where a supernatural entity was officially blamed for someone's death, documented by the state government itself. In 1817, in the rolling hills of Robertson County, Tennessee, John Bell was a respected farmer, living peacefully with his family, until something ancient and malevolent decided to make their lives a living nightmare. What started as a simple encounter with a strange creature, described as having a dog's body with a rabbit's head, quickly escalated into 4 years of documented terror that would attract visitors from across the nation, including future President Andrew Jackson himself. The Bell family consisted of John Bell, his wife Lucy, and their 9 children, living on a prosperous 320-acre farm near the Red River. John Bell was known throughout the community as an honest, God-fearing man who served as a church elder and was respected by all who knew him. This wasn't a family prone to superstition or flights of fancy. They were practical, hard-working people who had built their lives on solid ground. But on that fateful day, in 1817, when John Bell encountered the bizarre creature in his cornfield, their world would be turned upside down forever. The creature vanished when Bell shot at it. But that night, the family began hearing strange knocking sounds on the walls of their log cabin, sounds that would soon evolve into something far more sinister. Initially, the disturbances were subtle. Scratching sounds in the walls, the sound of rats gnawing, and occasional thumping noises that seemed to move throughout the house. The family searched everywhere for the source, but found nothing. As days turned into weeks, the phenomena intensified dramatically. Invisible hands began pulling covers off beds in the middle of the night, leaving family members shivering in the cold. Heavy furniture would slide across floors on its own, and the sound of chains dragging through the house would wake the family from their sleep. But it was when the entity began physically attacking young Betsy Bell that the family realized they were dealing with something truly malevolent. Betsy, who was just 12 years old when the haunting began, bore the brunt of the entity's wrath. Witnesses would watch in horror as invisible hands would slap her face, leaving red handprints on her cheeks. Her hair would be pulled so violently that she would scream in pain. Yet no one could see what was attacking her. The entity seemed particularly focused on tormenting this innocent child, pinching her arms and legs until they were covered in bruises, and sometimes lifting her completely off the ground and shaking her like a rag doll. The family was helpless to protect her, as there was nothing visible to fight against, nothing physical they could confront or drive away. Word of the Bell family's plight spread throughout Robertson County, and curious neighbors began visiting the farm to witness the phenomena for themselves. What they saw defied all rational explanation and converted even the most skeptical visitors into believers. The entity, which had remained silent during its early manifestations, suddenly began to speak. At first, it was just whispers and mumbled words, but gradually it developed into a clear, distinct voice that could carry on conversations with anyone in the room. The voice claimed to be multiple entities at different times. Sometimes it said it was the spirit of an early settler who had been murdered and buried on the property. Other times it claimed to be a demon sent from hell. But most consistently, it identified itself as Kate Batts, a local woman who had engaged in a bitter land dispute with John Bell years earlier. Kate Batts was indeed a real person, an eccentric woman known throughout the community for her sharp tongue and vindictive nature. She had accused John Bell of cheating her in a land deal and had publicly cursed him, swearing that she would get her revenge even if it took her beyond the grave. When the entity claimed to be Kate's spirit, it demonstrated intimate knowledge of the dispute and expressed the same bitter hatred toward John Bell that Kate Batts had harbored in life. But here's where the story becomes even more chilling. Kate Batts was still alive when the haunting began, living just a few miles away from the Bell farm. How could her spirit be tormenting the Bell family while she was still breathing? The entity's knowledge seemed limitless and impossible. It would quote entire sermons from churches located miles away, reciting them word for word as if it had been present during the service. On one particularly memorable occasion, it recited 2 different sermons simultaneously, one from a Methodist church 13 miles to the north, and another from a Baptist church 15 miles to the south. speaking both sermons at the same time in different voices, never missing a word or getting the content confused. Visiting ministers who came to investigate would be shocked to hear their own private prayers repeated back to them, including thoughts they had never spoken aloud. The entities seemed to know the intimate details of everyone's lives, revealing secrets and private conversations that no earthly being could have known. As news of the Bell Witch spread beyond Robertson County, it attracted visitors from across Tennessee and neighboring states. Newspaper reporters came to investigate and left as believers, writing detailed accounts of what they had witnessed. Scientists and scholars arrived expecting to debunk what they assumed was an elaborate hoax, only to leave convinced that they had encountered something beyond or the realm of natural explanation. The entities seemed to enjoy the attention, often putting on elaborate performances for visitors, moving furniture around the room, making objects appear and disappear, and engaging in lengthy conversations about theology, philosophy, and current events with a knowledge that seemed to span centuries. But it was the visit of General Andrew Jackson that truly legitimized the Bell Witch case in the eyes of the public. Jackson, who was already a national hero for his victory at the Battle of New Orleans and would later become president, heard about the haunting and decided to investigate personally. He arrived at the Bell farm with a wagon full of men and supplies, intending to spend several days getting to the bottom of the mystery. However, as soon as his wagon reached the Bell property line, the wheels mysteriously locked up and refused to turn, despite the horses straining with all their might. Jackson's men examined the wagon thoroughly, but could find nothing wrong with it. It was then that the Bell Witch's voice rang out clearly, welcoming General Jackson to the farm and giving permission for the wagon to proceed. Immediately, the wheels began turning again, as if nothing had happened. During his stay at the Bell farm, Jackson witnessed phenomena that he later described as the most extraordinary events of his life. He saw furniture moving on its own, heard the entity's voice conversing with his men, and watched as invisible hands interacted with physical objects. One of Jackson's men, who had boasted that he was a witch tamer and had brought special silver bullets to kill the entity, found himself being slapped and kicked by invisible forces until he fled the property in terror. Jackson himself was reportedly so unnerved by what he experienced that he cut his visit short and left after just one night, later telling friends that he would rather fight the British Army again than spend another night at the Bell farm. The entity's hatred for John Bell became increasingly apparent as the months turned into years. While it would sometimes be playful or even helpful with other family members, occasionally doing chores around the house or providing information about distant relatives, it reserved its most vicious attacks for John Bell himself. It would curse him with language so foul that visitors were shocked, threaten him with violence, and predict his death with gleeful anticipation. The constant stress and terror began to take a severe toll on John Bell's health. He developed a nervous condition that caused his tongue to swell, making it difficult for him to eat or speak. His hands would shake uncontrollably, and he suffered from what appeared to be seizures that left him weak and disoriented. As John Bell's health deteriorated, the Bell Witch became increasingly bold in its threats. It would taunt him about his declining condition, claiming credit for his suffering and promising that worse was yet to come. The entity seemed to feed off his fear and pain, growing stronger and more malevolent as he grew weaker. Family members and friends watched helplessly as John Bell, once a strong and vibrant man, became a shadow of his former self. The entity would sometimes prevent him from eating by making his throat close up whenever he tried to swallow, or it would cause him to have violent fits whenever he attempted to leave the house. The climax of this 4-year reign of terror came on the morning of December 19th, 1820. John Bell had been feeling particularly unwell and had taken to his bed early the previous evening. When family members went to check on him the next morning, they found him in a strange, catatonic state. He was breathing but completely unresponsive, his eyes open but unseeing, his body rigid and cold to the touch. On the nightstand beside his bed was a small vial containing a dark, smoky liquid that no one in the family had ever seen before. When they asked the Bell Witch about the mysterious vial, the entity's voice filled the room with triumphant laughter. "I gave old Jack a dose of that last night while he was sleeping," the voice declared with obvious satisfaction. "He'll never get up from that bed again." When family members asked what the liquid was, the entity replied that it was a special poison that it had prepared specifically for John Bell. To test the truth of this claim, someone suggested giving a drop of the liquid to the family cat. As soon as the liquid touched the cat's tongue, the animal went into violent convulsions and died within minutes. The family immediately threw the vial into the fireplace, where it exploded with a bright blue flame that shot up the chimney. John Bell lingered in his catatonic state for one more day before passing away on December 20th, 1820. Even in death, he could not escape the Bell Witch's torment. During his funeral, the entity's voice could be heard singing drinking songs and making crude jokes about the deceased, shocking the mourners and adding one final insult to years of persecution. But perhaps the most significant aspect of John Bell's death was how it was officially recorded. The attending physician, Dr. George Hobson, was so convinced that supernatural forces had caused Bell's death that he listed the cause as supernatural on the official death certificate filed with the state of Tennessee. This makes John Bell the only person in American history to be officially recognized as a victim of supernatural murder by a state government. After John Bell's death, the Bell Witch's activity began to diminish, though it did not disappear entirely. The entity seemed satisfied that it had accomplished its primary goal of destroying the man it held responsible for its grievances. It continued to manifest occasionally, sometimes helping Lucy Bell with household tasks or providing comfort to the family in their grief. The entity claimed that it had grown fond of Lucy Bell, calling her Old Luce with apparent affection and promising to protect her from harm. It also seemed to have developed a special relationship with John Bell, Jr., the eldest son, often engaging him in lengthy conversations about family matters and offering advice about managing the farm. But the Bell Witch had one final surprise for the family. Before departing, it made a chilling promise that would haunt the Bell descendants for generations to come. The entity announced that it would return to the Bell family in exactly 7 years, in 1828, and that its return would be even more terrifying than its original manifestation. True to its word, in 1828, strange phenomena began occurring again at the Bell farm, though they were less intense and shorter in duration than the original haunting. The entity's voice was heard again, though more faintly, and there were reports of objects moving and strange sounds in the night. However, this second manifestation lasted only a few weeks before the Bell Witch departed once again, this time claiming that it would return in 107 years to torment John Bell's descendants. The Bell Witch case remains unique in American supernatural history, not just because of its official recognition by state authorities, but because of the sheer volume of credible witnesses and documentation that supports it. Unlike most ghost stories that rely on second-hand accounts and folklore, the Bell Witch haunting was witnessed by hundreds of people from all walks of life, including government officials, ministers, doctors, lawyers, and newspaper reporters. These witnesses came from different backgrounds, had different motivations, and had no reason to collaborate in creating a hoax. Yet their accounts remained remarkably consistent across the 4-year period of the haunting. The case was also unique in the level of interaction between the supernatural entity and the living witnesses. Most ghost stories involve brief sightings or unexplained phenomena. But the Bell Witch engaged in lengthy conversations, demonstrated vast knowledge, and maintained consistent personality traits over years of manifestation. It had preferences, opinions, and emotional responses that remained constant regardless of who was present or what questions were asked. This level of consistency and complexity would have been nearly impossible to fake, especially given the technology and communication methods available in the early 19th century. Modern researchers and paranormal investigators continue to study the Bell Witch case, and many consider it to be the most well-documented supernatural event in American history. The original Bell Farm is now a tourist attraction, and visitors still report strange occurrences on the property. Some claim to hear unexplained voices, see objects moving on their own, or feel invisible hands touching them. Whether these modern reports represent genuine supernatural activity or are simply the power of suggestion influenced by the location's notorious history remains a matter of debate. What cannot be debated, however, is the historical significance of the Bell Witch case and its impact on American folklore and supernatural research. It established a template for how supernatural phenomena could be investigated and documented. And it demonstrated that even the most extraordinary claims could be taken seriously when supported by sufficient credible testimony. The case also highlighted the complex relationship between belief, fear, and social dynamics in early American communities, showing how supernatural events could both divide and unite people in their search for explanations. The Bell Witch story continues to fascinate and terrify people more than 2 centuries after it began, not just because of its supernatural elements, but because of its very human story of a family under siege, a community grappling with the unexplained, and the ultimate question of what lies beyond our understanding of the natural world. In a time when scientific rationalism was beginning to challenge traditional beliefs about the supernatural, the Bell Witch case stood as a stark reminder that there might still be forces in the world that defy explanation. Forces that can reach across the boundary between life and death to settle old scores and fulfill ancient promises of revenge. Now let's move to our second story. And prepare yourself, because what happened on September 12th, 1952, in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia, would become one of the most thoroughly documented and terrifying cryptid encounters in American history. This isn't just another UFO sighting or monster tale. This is a case with multiple credible witnesses, physical evidence, and official investigations that continue to baffle researchers over 70 years later. On that fateful Friday evening, as the sun was setting over the rolling hills of Braxton County, 3 young boys were playing football in the schoolyard when they witnessed something that would change their lives forever and thrust their quiet mountain community into the international spotlight. The boys, Eddie May, age 13, his brother Freddie May, age 12, and their friend Tommy Heyer, age 10, were typical small-town kids enjoying the last warm days of summer when they saw a bright, fiery object streak across the darkening sky. At first, they thought it might be a meteor or shooting star. But as they watched in fascination, the object seemed to slow down and change direction before disappearing behind a hill on the Bailey Fisher farm, about half a mile from where they stood. What they saw next convinced them that this was no ordinary celestial event. A pulsing red glow began emanating from the hilltop, where the object had apparently landed. casting an eerie crimson light through the trees and creating an atmosphere of otherworldly dread that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Excited and curious about what they had witnessed, the boys raced to the May family home to tell Eddie and Freddie's mother, Kathleen May, about the strange object they had seen crash into the hillside. Mrs. May, a practical woman who worked as a beautician in town, was initially skeptical of her son's claims, but their obvious excitement and the fact that all three boys were telling the same story convinced her that they had indeed seen something unusual. When the boys begged her to drive them to the crash site to investigate, she agreed, but insisted that they bring along some additional witnesses for safety. They quickly recruited Eugene Lemon, a 17-year-old National Guardsman who lived nearby, and Lemon's dog, a German Shepherd mix that was known for its courage and protective instincts. The group of 7, Mrs. May, her 2 sons, Tommy Heyer, Eugene Lemon, and 2 other local boys who had joined them, Max Lockard and Ronald Shaver, piled into Mrs. May's car and drove to the Fisher farm as darkness settled over the mountain landscape. As they approached the area where the boys claimed to have seen the object land, they noticed a strange, acrid smell in the air that burned their nostrils and made their eyes water. It was unlike anything any of them had ever encountered. A metallic, chemical odor that seemed to coat the inside of their throats and made several members of the group feel nauseous. The smell was so intense and unpleasant that some of them considered turning back. But their curiosity about what they might find drove them forward up the steep hillside. Eugene Lemon, being the oldest and most physically capable member of the group, took the lead as they climbed through the dense woods toward the source of the mysterious red glow. He carried a flashlight, which provided the only illumination as they made their way through the thick underbrush and around fallen logs. The dog, normally eager to explore new territory, seemed increasingly agitated as they climbed higher, whimpering and staying close to the group instead of ranging ahead as it usually did. About halfway up the hill, they began to hear strange sounds coming from the direction of the red glow, a rhythmic pulsing or humming noise that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet, accompanied by occasional hissing sounds that reminded them of steam escaping from a radiator. As they crested the hill and approached a small clearing, the red glow became much more intense, and they could see that it was emanating from behind a large oak tree near the center of the open space. The pulsing light created an almost hypnotic effect, growing brighter and dimmer in a steady rhythm that seemed to match the strange humming sound they had been hearing. Eugene Lemon raised his flashlight and directed its beam toward the source of the glow. And what happened next would be burned into the memories of all 7 witnesses for the rest of their lives. There, hovering or standing behind the oak tree, was a creature unlike anything any of them had ever seen or could have imagined in their worst nightmares. The entity was enormous, at least 10 feet tall by all accounts, with a bulbous round head that glowed with the same pulsing red light they had been seeing from a distance. The head appeared to be surrounded by, or encased in, a pointed, hood-like structure that extended several feet above and around the creature's face, giving it an almost medieval or ecclesiastical appearance that was both majestic and terrifying. The most disturbing feature, however, were the eyes. 2 large, bright red orbs that seemed to burn with an inner fire and fix themselves immediately on the group of terrified humans who had stumbled into its domain. The eyes showed an intelligence that was unmistakably alien, yet there was something malevolent about their gaze that suggested this creature was not merely curious about the humans it had encountered. The creature's body was harder to make out in the dim light, but witnesses described it as being dark and either floating slightly above the ground or gliding without any visible means of locomotion. Some reported seeing what appeared to be clawed hands or appendages, while others described a more amorphous lower body that seemed to flow rather than walk. What all the witnesses agreed on was the creature's immediate reaction to being discovered. It let out a hissing sound that was so loud and piercing that it seemed to penetrate their very bones. And it began moving toward them with a fluid, unnatural motion that defied the laws of physics as they understood them. The group's reaction was immediate and unanimous. They turned and fled down the hillside as fast as their legs could carry them, crashing through the underbrush and stumbling over rocks and fallen branches in their desperate attempt to escape whatever they had encountered. Eugene Lemon, despite being the oldest and presumably bravest member of the group, was among the first to run, later admitting that the sight of the creature had filled him with a primal terror, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The dog, which had been whimpering and staying close to the group, now ran ahead of them, apparently as eager to escape as the humans were. As they fled, several members of the group reported feeling as though they were being followed or watched, and some claimed to hear the creature's hissing sound echoing through the trees behind them. The acrid smell seemed to follow them as well, clinging to their clothes and hair and continuing to burn their throats and eyes, even after they had reached the safety of Mrs. May's car. By the time they made it back to town, several members of the group were feeling violently ill, with symptoms that included nausea, vomiting, and difficulty breathing. Mrs. May herself became so sick that she had to be treated by the local doctor, who was puzzled by her symptoms and could offer no explanation for what might have caused them. Word of the encounter spread quickly through Flatwoods and the surrounding communities, and by the next morning, the small town was buzzing with excitement and speculation about what the group had seen on the Fisher farm. Local newspaper reporter A. Lee Stewart arrived early Saturday morning to investigate the story and interview the witnesses. Stewart was a skeptical journalist who had initially assumed he would be debunking what he expected to be a case of mass hysteria or mistaken identity. But after speaking with each witness separately and hearing their remarkably consistent accounts, he began to take their claims seriously. Stewart convinced several of the witnesses to return to the crash site with him in broad daylight to look for evidence of what they had encountered. What they found on the hillside only deepened the mystery and provided physical proof that something extraordinary had indeed occurred the night before. In the area where the witnesses claimed to have seen the creature, they discovered a series of strange skid marks or impressions in the ground that appeared to have been made by something large and heavy landing or sliding across the earth. The marks were unlike anything that could have been made by known aircraft or vehicles, and they showed a pattern that suggested whatever had created them had approached from the sky at a steep angle. Even more disturbing were the effects on the local vegetation in the immediate area of the sighting. Trees and bushes showed signs of having been exposed to intense heat, with leaves that were wilted and blackened as if they had been burned. Yet there was no evidence of an actual fire. The grass in several spots was flattened in circular patterns, and there were areas where the soil itself appeared to have been somehow altered or contaminated. The acrid smell that the witnesses had reported was still faintly detectable the next day, particularly in the areas where the vegetation showed the most damage. Stewart's investigation and subsequent newspaper articles brought the Flatwoods Monster case to national attention, and within days, Reporters and investigators from major newspapers and magazines were descending on the small West Virginia town. The story was picked up by wire services and appeared in newspapers across the country, making the Flatwoods Monster one of the first cryptid encounters to receive widespread media coverage in the modern era. The attention was both exciting and overwhelming for the residents of Flatwoods, many of whom had never dealt with reporters or outside investigators before. The case also attracted the attention of official investigators, including representatives from the United States Air Force, who were conducting Project Blue Book investigations into UFO sightings across the country during this period. The Air Force investigators interviewed the witnesses and examined the physical evidence at the crash site. But their official conclusion was that the witnesses had probably seen a meteor and mistaken a barn owl perched in a tree for the creature they described. This explanation was immediately rejected by the witnesses, who pointed out that they were all familiar with local wildlife and would certainly recognize a barn owl even in poor lighting conditions. The Air Force explanation also failed to account for the physical evidence found at the site, including the skid marks, the damaged vegetation, and the lingering chemical smell that had made several witnesses ill. Local residents who knew the area well pointed out that there were no barns or other structures nearby where an owl might have been roosting, and the size and behavior described by the witnesses were completely inconsistent with any known bird species. The dismissive attitude of the official investigators only served to strengthen the resolve of the witnesses and their supporters, who felt that their accounts were being unfairly discredited without proper consideration of all the evidence. In the weeks and months following the initial encounter, several other residents of the Flatwoods area reported their own sightings of strange lights, unusual creatures, and unexplained phenomena. Some of these reports came from people who had not heard about the original incident until after they had their own experiences, lending additional credibility to the witnesses' accounts. A few residents reported finding additional physical evidence, including more unusual marks on the ground and continued damage to vegetation in areas where strange lights had been seen. The Flatwoods Monster case became a defining moment in American cryptid research and UFO investigation, establishing many of the protocols and standards that would be used in future investigations of similar phenomena. It demonstrated the importance of immediate investigation and documentation of physical evidence, the value of interviewing multiple witnesses separately to check for consistency, and the need to take such reports seriously even when they challenge conventional understanding of what is possible. Eugene Lemon, the teenager who had led the group up the hillside and gotten the closest look at the creature, remained haunted by the experience for the rest of his life. In interviews conducted decades later, he maintained that what he had seen was real and unlike anything that could be explained by conventional means. He described the creature's eyes as being the most terrifying aspect of the encounter, saying that they seemed to look right through him and filled him with a sense of dread that he had never experienced before or since. Lemon's son, Eugene Lemon III, later became an advocate for preserving the memory of the Flatwoods Monster case and ensuring that his father's account was accurately recorded for future generations. The case also had a lasting impact on the community of Flatwoods itself, which embraced its connection to the mysterious creature and made it a part of the town's identity. Today, Flatwoods celebrates its cryptid heritage with an annual festival, and a large statue of the Flatwoods Monster stands in the town center as a reminder of that terrifying night in 1952. The case continues to attract researchers and enthusiasts from around the world, and new investigations are still being conducted using modern technology and forensic techniques. What makes the Flatwoods Monster case particularly compelling is not just the number of witnesses or the physical evidence, but the lasting impact it had on everyone involved. These were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a small mountain community, and their encounter with something extraordinary changed them permanently. They had nothing to gain and much to lose by coming forward with their story. Yet they maintained their accounts consistently for decades, even in the face of ridicule and official dismissal. The case also raises profound questions about what might be sharing our world with us, hidden in the remote mountains and forests where few people venture after dark. The Appalachian region has a long history of unexplained phenomena and cryptid encounters, and the Flatwoods Monster incident fits into a broader pattern of strange events that suggest these ancient mountains may harbor secrets that we are only beginning to understand. Whether the creature was extraterrestrial in origin, an unknown species of terrestrial animal, or something else entirely, the Flatwoods Monster case remains one of the most thoroughly documented and credible cryptid encounters in American history, a reminder that there are still mysteries in our world that defy easy explanation. Moving to our third story, we venture into one of Appalachia's most enduring and mysterious phenomena. A supernatural occurrence that has been witnessed, documented, and investigated for over 250 years, yet remains as inexplicable today as it was when German engineer John William Gerard de Bram first recorded it in 1771. The Brown Mountain Lights of North Carolina represent something truly extraordinary in the world of paranormal research. A consistently recurring supernatural event, with hundreds of credible witnesses spanning multiple centuries, government investigations, and scientific studies that have all failed to provide a satisfactory explanation for what thousands of people continue to see dancing across the ancient peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Brown Mountain itself is an imposing ridge that rises nearly 2,600 feet above sea level in the Pisgah National Forest of North Carolina, part of the ancient Appalachian chain that has stood for over 1 billion years. The mountain's dark, forested slopes and rocky outcroppings create a dramatic silhouette against the sky. But it's what appears above and around these peaks that has captured the imagination and terror of observers for generations. The lights manifest as glowing orbs of various sizes and colors, most commonly described as pale yellow, orange, or red, that appear to dance, hover, and move independently across the mountain's ridgeline and through the valleys below. Unlike any known natural phenomenon, these lights display what can only be described as intelligent behavior, seeming to respond to observers, grouping together and separating, and following patterns that suggest purpose and awareness. The first documented sighting by a European observer came from de Bram, a respected surveyor and engineer working for the British colonial government, who was conducting a geographical survey of the region when he witnessed the mysterious illuminations. His official report, filed with colonial authorities, described seeing numerous lights appearing and disappearing at regular intervals along the mountain ridge. Lights that could not be attributed to any known source such as campfires, torches, or natural phenomena. What made de Bram's account particularly significant was his professional credibility and the fact that he had no cultural context for interpreting what he saw. He was simply recording an observed phenomenon as part of his official duties. However, the Cherokee people who had inhabited this region for thousands of years before European contact had their own explanations for the Brown Mountain Lights. Explanations rooted in tragedy and spiritual belief that would prove to be remarkably persistent and emotionally resonant. According to Cherokee oral tradition, the lights are the spirits of Cherokee women who died of grief after a great battle between Cherokee and Catawba warriors on Brown Mountain centuries ago. The story tells of a fierce conflict that raged for days, leaving the mountainside littered with the bodies of warriors from both tribes. When the Cherokee women came searching for their husbands, fathers, and sons among the dead, many were so overcome with grief upon finding their loved ones' bodies that they died on the spot, their hearts literally breaking from the magnitude of their loss. The Cherokee believed that these women's spirits, unable to find peace in death because of their overwhelming sorrow and their desperate need to continue searching for their lost warriors, were condemned to wander the mountain forever, carrying spiritual torches as they maintained their eternal vigil. This explanation gave the lights a deeply human and tragic dimension that resonated with later observers, regardless of their cultural background. The idea that the lights represented love transcending death, grief so profound that it could manifest physically in the world of the living, and the unbreakable bonds between family members struck a chord with everyone who heard the story and witnessed the phenomenon for themselves. As European settlement of the region increased throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, reports of the Brown Mountain Lights became more frequent and detailed. Settlers, hunters, and travelers regularly reported seeing the mysterious illuminations, and the lights became part of local folklore and oral tradition. What made these accounts particularly compelling was their consistency. Witnesses from different time periods, backgrounds, and locations all described essentially the same phenomenon. Glowing orbs that appeared at night, moved independently across the mountain landscape, and displayed behavior that seemed to indicate intelligence or purpose. The lights gained national attention in the early 20th century when they began to be reported in newspapers and magazines, attracting the interest of scientists and government investigators. In 1913, the United States Geological Survey conducted the first official scientific investigation of the Brown Mountain Lights, sending a team of researchers to observe and document the phenomenon. The initial investigation concluded that the lights were reflections of locomotive headlights from the Linville Valley, a reasonable explanation that seemed to solve the mystery once and for all. However, this explanation was dramatically challenged just 9 years later, when a massive flood swept through the region in 1916, destroying railroad tracks, bridges, and most of the infrastructure in the Linville Valley. With no trains running and no electric lights operating in the area, observers expected the Brown Mountain Lights to disappear. Instead, the lights continued to appear with the same frequency and intensity as before, completely undermining the locomotive theory and forcing investigators to look for alternative explanations. In 1922, the United States Geological Survey returned to Brown Mountain to conduct a more thorough investigation, this time bringing more sophisticated equipment and a larger team of researchers. The second investigation lasted several months and involved careful observation and documentation of the lights under various weather conditions and at different times of night. The researchers were able to observe the lights directly and confirm that they were indeed a real phenomenon, not the result of optical illusions, atmospheric conditions, or misidentified conventional light sources. The 1922 investigation team proposed several new theories to explain the lights, including the possibility that they were caused by spontaneous combustion of gases seeping from the mountain, electrical discharges created by underground mineral deposits, or some form of bioluminescence from unknown organisms living in the forest. However, none of these theories could fully account for the lights' behavior, particularly their apparent ability to move independently and respond to observers. The investigators were forced to conclude that while the Brown Mountain Lights were definitely real, They remained unexplained by current scientific understanding. Dr. Daniel Caton, an astronomer at Appalachian State University who has studied the Brown Mountain Lights for decades, represents the modern scientific approach to understanding this phenomenon. Dr. Caton has observed the lights personally on multiple occasions and has used sophisticated equipment to try to determine their nature and origin. His research has confirmed that the lights are indeed a genuine phenomenon that cannot be explained by conventional light sources, atmospheric conditions, or optical illusions. Dr. Caton's observations have revealed several fascinating characteristics of the Brown Mountain Lights that make them even more mysterious. The lights appear to have a consistent pattern of behavior, typically appearing shortly after sunset and continuing throughout the night until just before dawn. They tend to be more active during certain weather conditions, particularly on clear nights with low humidity. But they have been observed under virtually all weather conditions, including rain, snow, and fog. The lights vary in size from small pinpoints to large orbs several feet in diameter, and they can appear singly or in groups of up to a dozen or more. Perhaps most intriguingly, the lights seem to respond to human presence and observation. Dr. Cotton and other researchers have noted that the lights often become more active when observers are present, almost as if they are aware of being watched. Some witnesses have reported that the lights appear to approach observation points, hover near groups of people, and even seem to perform for audiences by moving in patterns or formations that suggest intentional display behavior. The emotional impact of witnessing the Brown Mountain Lights cannot be overstated. People who have seen them describe feeling a profound sense of awe mixed with an inexplicable sadness, as if they are witnessing something deeply tragic and beautiful at the same time. Many observers report feeling as though they are in the presence of something ancient and spiritual, something that connects them to the long history of human experience in these mountains. The Cherokee explanation of the lights as grieving spirits resonates strongly with many witnesses, regardless of their cultural background or religious beliefs. Modern technology has allowed researchers to study the Brown Mountain Lights in ways that were impossible for earlier investigators. Infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and other sophisticated instruments have been used to try to determine the physical nature of the lights. But the results have only deepened the mystery. The lights do not appear to generate heat signatures that would be expected from conventional light sources. They do not create electromagnetic disturbances that would indicate electrical phenomena, and they do not behave in ways consistent with any known natural or artificial light sources. Some researchers have suggested that the Brown Mountain Lights might represent a form of earth energy or geological phenomenon that is not yet understood by mainstream science. The mountain sits on ancient geological formations that contain various minerals and underground water sources. And it's possible that some combination of these factors creates conditions that can produce the observed light phenomena. However, this theory still cannot explain the light's apparent intelligence and responsiveness to human observers. The Brown Mountain Lights have also attracted attention from paranormal researchers who see them as evidence of spiritual or supernatural activity. The consistency of the Cherokee explanation, the emotional responses of witnesses, and the lights' seemingly intelligent behavior all support the theory that they represent some form of spiritual manifestation. Whether one believes in the literal truth of the Cherokee story about grieving spirits or sees it as a metaphorical explanation for a phenomenon that transcends current scientific understanding, the spiritual dimension of the Brown Mountain Lights cannot be easily dismissed. The lights continue to be observed and reported by hundreds of people each year, from casual tourists to serious researchers. The North Carolina tourism industry has embraced the mystery, with several official viewing areas established along the Blue Ridge Parkway and local roads where visitors can watch for the lights. The Brown Mountain Lights have become part of the cultural identity of Western North Carolina, featured in local festivals, tourist attractions, and educational programs. What makes the Brown Mountain Lights particularly significant in the context of Appalachian supernatural phenomena is their longevity and consistency. Unlike many paranormal events that are reported briefly and then fade from memory, the Brown Mountain Lights have maintained a continuous presence in the region for over 2.5 centuries. They represent a bridge between the ancient spiritual traditions of the Cherokee people and the modern scientific worldview, challenging both to expand their understanding of what is possible in our world. The lights also embody many of the themes that run through Appalachian folklore and supernatural tradition: the connection between the living and the dead, the power of love and grief to transcend physical boundaries, and the idea that the ancient mountains themselves hold memories and spirits from the past. For many people who live in the region, the Brown Mountain Lights are not just a curiosity or tourist attraction, but a reminder of the deep spiritual history of their homeland and the ongoing presence of forces that cannot be easily explained or controlled. As we continue to study and observe the Brown Mountain Lights, they serve as a humbling reminder that despite all our technological advances and scientific knowledge, there are still mysteries in our world that defy explanation. They challenge us to remain open to possibilities beyond our current understanding, and to respect the wisdom of indigenous peoples who have lived with these phenomena for thousands of years. Whether the lights are ultimately explained by future scientific discoveries or remain forever mysterious, they will continue to inspire wonder, respect, and a sense of connection to something greater than ourselves in all who witness their eternal dance across the ancient peaks of Brown Mountain. Let's move to our fourth story. And what I'm about to tell you represents one of the most chilling and well-documented cases of supernatural prophecy in American history. This isn't just another cryptid sighting. This is the terrifying account of a creature that appeared to warn an entire community of impending disaster. A harbinger whose presence preceded one of the most tragic bridge collapses in United States history. The Mothman phenomenon of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, stands as perhaps the most haunting example of how the supernatural and the tragic can intertwine, leaving us to wonder whether some entities exist not to harm us, but to warn us of horrors yet to come. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, sits at the confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, a small industrial town that in 1966 was home to about 6,000 residents who lived quiet, predictable lives centered around the local chemical plant and river commerce. The town's most prominent feature was the Silver Bridge, a suspension bridge built in 1928 that connected Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, carrying thousands of commuters and travelers across the Ohio River every day. It was a community where everyone knew everyone else, where unusual events were rare and quickly became the subject of local gossip. Nothing could have prepared the residents of Point Pleasant for what was about to descend upon their peaceful town and change their lives forever. The first encounter occurred on the night of November 12th, 1966, when 5 men were digging a grave in a cemetery near Clendenin, West Virginia, about 90 miles from Point Pleasant. As they worked by the light of their lanterns, they reported seeing what they described as a brown human being with wings flying low over their heads. The creature made no sound as it passed overhead, but its presence filled the men with such terror that they abandoned their work and fled the cemetery immediately. This initial sighting might have been dismissed as a case of overactive imagination or misidentification, but it was only the beginning of a wave of encounters that would terrorize the Ohio Valley for the next 13 months. 3 days later, on November 15th, 1966, the creature made its most famous appearance in an encounter that would define the Mothman legend and establish the basic description that hundreds of subsequent witnesses would confirm with remarkable consistency. Two young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Millette, were driving near the abandoned West Virginia Ordnance Works, a former World War II munitions factory known locally as the TNT area, because of the concrete bunkers and storage igloos that dotted the 2,500-acre site. The couples were looking for friends and taking a late-night drive through the deserted industrial complex when their headlights illuminated something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Standing near an old generator plant was a creature unlike anything they had ever seen or imagined. It stood upright like a man, but was much larger, estimated to be between 6 and 7 feet tall, with a massive wingspan that Roger Scarberry later described as being 10 feet from tip to tip. The creature's most terrifying feature was its eyes. Two large hypnotic red orbs that seemed to glow with their own internal light and fixed themselves on the terrified occupants of the car with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. The creature had no visible head in the conventional sense. Instead, the glowing red eyes appeared to be set directly into its shoulders, giving it an alien and deeply unsettling appearance. What happened next would become one of the most famous chase sequences in cryptid history. As the couple stared in shock at the creature, it suddenly spread its enormous wings and took flight, not with the flapping motion of a bird, but with a smooth, effortless gliding motion that defied the laws of aerodynamics as they understood them. The creature began following their car as Roger Scarberry pressed the accelerator to the floor, reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour on the winding country roads. Despite the car's high speed, the creature had no difficulty keeping pace, gliding alongside and sometimes directly above the vehicle without any apparent effort or strain. The chase continued for several miles as the terrified couples watched the creature through their windows and windshield, its red eyes never leaving them, its massive form blocking out stars as it passed overhead. Linda Scarberry later described the experience as the most terrifying moments of her life, saying that the creature's eyes seemed to look directly into her soul, and that she felt a sense of overwhelming dread that went beyond simple fear. The creature finally broke off its pursuit as they approached the outskirts of Point Pleasant, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving the four witnesses shaken and struggling to comprehend what they had experienced. The couples immediately drove to the Mason County Sheriff's Office to report their encounter, and Deputy Millard Halstead took their statement seriously enough to drive back to the TNT area with them to investigate. Although they found no trace of the creature, Halstead noted that all four witnesses were genuinely terrified and that their accounts were consistent and detailed. The deputy's willingness to take the report seriously and his confirmation that the witnesses appeared credible helped establish the legitimacy of the encounter and encouraged other people who had seen similar things to come forward with their own accounts. Word of the Mothman sighting spread quickly through Point Pleasant and the surrounding communities, and within days, the local newspaper had picked up the story. The creature was dubbed Mothman by copy editor Bill Powell of the Point Pleasant Register, who was inspired by the Batman television series that was popular at the time. The name stuck and soon people throughout the Ohio Valley were using it to describe the mysterious winged creature that was being seen with increasing frequency throughout the region. Over the following weeks and months, reports of Mothman encounters poured in from across West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. A large winged humanoid creature with glowing red eyes that appeared primarily at night and seemed to be particularly drawn to the TNT area and other industrial sites along the Ohio River. Witnesses included police officers, firefighters, construction workers, and ordinary citizens from all walks of life. People who had no reason to fabricate such stories and everything to lose by being associated with what many considered to be a ridiculous hoax or mass hysteria. One of the most credible witnesses was Connie Carpenter, a hairdresser from New Haven, West Virginia, who encountered the creature on November 27, 1966, while driving home from work. Carpenter reported that the creature landed on her car and kept pace with her vehicle for several miles, its red eyes staring down at her through the windshield, while its massive wings spread across the entire width of her car. She described feeling paralyzed with fear and said that the creature's eyes seemed to communicate with her telepathically, filling her mind with images and sensations that she couldn't fully understand or describe. Another significant encounter occurred on December 6, 1966, when 4 witnesses, including 2 volunteer firefighters, reported seeing the creature near the TNT area. The firefighters, who were considered highly credible witnesses due to their training and experience in emergency situations, described the creature as being much larger than previous estimates, with a wingspan that they calculated to be at least 15 feet across. They also noted that the creature made no sound when it flew, moving through the air with complete silence despite its enormous size. As the sightings continued, a pattern began to emerge that would prove to be prophetically significant. Many witnesses reported that their encounters with the Mothman were accompanied by feelings of impending doom, of visions of disaster, or premonitions of tragedy. Some people reported having nightmares about bridge collapses, airplane crashes, or other catastrophic events after seeing the creature. Others experienced telephone problems, electrical disturbances, and other unexplained phenomena that seemed to be connected to their Mothman encounters. Mary Heyer, a reporter for the Point Pleasant Register, who covered many of the Mothman stories, began documenting these premonitions and strange occurrences, noting that several witnesses had reported specific visions of a bridge collapse involving many casualties. At the time, these reports seemed like the product of overactive imaginations or psychological stress caused by the ongoing wave of cryptid sightings. However, in retrospect, these premonitions would prove to be tragically accurate predictions of what was to come. The Mothman sightings reached their peak in the weeks leading up to December 15, 1967, with multiple encounters reported almost daily throughout the Ohio Valley. Witnesses described the creature as becoming increasingly agitated and active, appearing more frequently and in more populated areas than it had during the earlier phases of the phenomenon. Some observers noted that the creature seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent, displaying behavior that suggested distress or warning rather than mere curiosity or malevolence. On the evening of December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge was carrying its usual heavy load of rush hour traffic when a critical structural failure occurred in one of the suspension chains. The failure happened without warning, and within seconds, the entire bridge collapsed into the icy waters of the Ohio River, taking with it 37 vehicles and 46 people, who died in one of the most tragic bridge disasters in American history. The collapse occurred during the height of the Christmas shopping season and many of the victims were families returning home with holiday gifts for their children. The timing of the bridge collapse in relation to the Mothman sightings was impossible to ignore. For over a year, witnesses had been reporting encounters with a mysterious creature that seemed to be trying to warn them of impending disaster. And many had experienced specific premonitions about a bridge collapse. The creature had been seen most frequently in the areas around the Silver Bridge, and had displayed increasingly agitated behavior in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. After the bridge collapse, the Mothman sightings in the Point Pleasant area ceased almost entirely, as if the creature's mission had been completed. The connection between the Mothman and the Silver Bridge disaster was explored in depth by journalist John Keel, who spent extensive time in Point Pleasant investigating the phenomenon and interviewing witnesses. Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, published in 1975, documented the encounters in detail and proposed that the creature was some form of interdimensional being or supernatural entity that had the ability to perceive future events and was attempting to warn humans about impending disasters. Keel's investigation revealed that similar mysterious creatures had been reported before other major disasters throughout history, suggesting that the Mothman might be part of a larger pattern of supernatural warnings that humans had been receiving, but largely ignoring. The psychological impact of the Mothman phenomenon on the Point Pleasant community cannot be overstated. The year-long wave of sightings had already created an atmosphere of tension and fear in the town, with many residents afraid to go out after dark and children having nightmares about the red-eyed creature. The bridge collapse, coming so soon after the peak of Mothman activity, left many people convinced that they had witnessed something truly supernatural and prophetic. Some residents felt guilty that they had not taken the creature's apparent warnings more seriously, while others were grateful that the mysterious entity had at least tried to alert them to the coming tragedy. The Mothman case also had a significant impact on the field of cryptid research and paranormal investigation. Unlike many cryptid encounters that involve brief sightings by isolated witnesses, the Mothman phenomenon involved over 100 documented encounters by multiple witnesses over a period of 13 months. The consistency of the descriptions, the credibility of many witnesses, and the apparent connection to a real-world disaster made this case impossible to dismiss as mere folklore or mass hysteria. Modern researchers continue to study the Mothman phenomenon, and new theories have emerged to explain what the witnesses might have encountered. Some researchers have suggested that the creature could have been a previously unknown species of large bird, possibly a sandhill crane or great horned owl that was misidentified under poor lighting conditions. However, these explanations fail to account for the creature's enormous size, its apparent intelligence, and its ability to keep pace with vehicles traveling at high speeds. Other researchers have proposed that the Mothman might have been some form of interdimensional being or time traveler that had knowledge of future events and was attempting to prevent the bridge disaster by warning the local population. This theory is supported by the creature's apparent ability to appear and disappear at will, its seemingly supernatural characteristics, and the timing of its appearances in relation to the bridge collapse. The town of Point Pleasant has embraced its connection to the Mothman legend, establishing an annual Mothman festival that attracts thousands of visitors from around the world. A 12-foot-tall statue of the creature stands in the town center, and the Mothman Museum houses artifacts and documentation related to the 1966 to 1967 sightings. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and a major motion picture, ensuring that the story of the Mothman continues to reach new audiences and inspire new investigations. Jeff Wamsley, a Point Pleasant native who has become one of the leading researchers of the Mothman phenomenon, has spent decades collecting witness accounts and investigating the case. Walmsley's research has revealed that similar creatures have been reported in the Point Pleasant area, both before and after the famous 1966 to 1967 wave of sightings, suggesting that the Mothman might be a recurring phenomenon rather than a single isolated event. His work has also uncovered historical accounts of mysterious winged creatures in the region, dating back to Native American times, indicating that the Mothman might be part of a much older and deeper mystery. The Mothman case raises profound questions about the nature of prophecy, the possibility of supernatural intervention in human affairs, and the relationship between the paranormal and real-world events. Whether the creature was attempting to warn the people of Point Pleasant about the coming disaster, or was simply a coincidental phenomenon that happened to occur before a tragic accident, the case remains one of the most compelling and well-documented examples of cryptid activity in American history. For the people who lived through the Mothman phenomenon and the Silver Bridge disaster, the experience was life-changing in ways that went far beyond the immediate trauma of the events themselves. Many witnesses reported that their encounters with the creature opened their minds to possibilities they had never considered before, and gave them a deeper appreciation for the mysteries that still exist in our world. Others found comfort in the idea that there might be benevolent forces in the universe that are trying to protect humanity from harm, even if we don't always understand their methods or heed their warnings. The legacy of the Mothman continues to influence how we think about cryptid encounters and paranormal phenomena. The case demonstrated that such events can have real-world consequences, and that dismissing them as mere superstition or fantasy might cause us to miss important information about potential dangers or opportunities. It also showed that communities can be profoundly affected by supernatural events, and that the psychological and cultural impact of such phenomena can persist for generations. As we continue to study and debate the Mothman case, it serves as a reminder that there are still mysteries in our world that challenge our understanding of what is possible and what is real. Whether the creature was a flesh and blood animal, an interdimensional visitor, or something else entirely, the Mothman of Point Pleasant remains one of the most fascinating and terrifying examples of how the supernatural can intersect with human tragedy, leaving us to wonder what other warnings we might be missing and what other guardians might be watching over us from the shadows. Moving to our fifth story, we delve into one of Appalachia's most ancient and terrifying legends, a tale that bridges the gap between Cherokee spiritual tradition and European settler folklore in ways that reveal the deep supernatural currents running through these mountains. The Wampus Cat represents something far more sinister than a simple cryptid sighting. It embodies the consequences of violating sacred laws, the price of forbidden knowledge, and the eternal punishment that awaits those who dare to transgress against the spiritual order that has governed these mountains for thousands of years. This is not just a monster story. It's a cautionary tale about respect, boundaries, and the terrible transformations that can occur when ancient taboos are broken. Long before European settlers ever set foot in the Appalachian Mountains, the Cherokee people had established complex spiritual traditions that governed every aspect of their relationship with the natural world. Among the most sacred of these traditions were the hunting rituals, ceremonies that were considered essential for maintaining the balance between the human and animal worlds. These rituals were not mere superstitions or cultural practices. They were viewed as fundamental spiritual laws that, if violated, could bring catastrophic consequences not just to the individual transgressor, but to the entire community. The hunting ceremonies were exclusively the domain of men, and women were strictly forbidden from witnessing or participating in these sacred rites under any circumstances. According to Cherokee oral tradition, there once lived a young woman whose curiosity about these forbidden rituals would lead to one of the most terrifying transformations in Native American folklore. She was described as beautiful, intelligent, and deeply devoted to her husband. But she possessed a fatal flaw, an insatiable curiosity about the mysteries that were kept hidden from women. Night after night, she would listen to the men preparing for their hunting expeditions, hearing fragments of chants and rituals that were meant only for male ears. The more she heard, the more desperate she became to witness these sacred ceremonies for herself, despite knowing that such knowledge was absolutely forbidden to her. The woman's opportunity came during one of the most important hunting expeditions of the year, a sacred hunt that would determine the tribe's success in the coming season. As the men gathered in a secret location deep in the forest to perform their most powerful and sacred rituals, the woman made a decision that would doom her for eternity. She wrapped herself in the hide of a mountain cat, using its natural camouflage to blend into the shadows of the forest, and crept close enough to the ceremonial site to observe the forbidden rites with her own eyes. For hours, she watched as the men performed ancient dances, chanted sacred words, and called upon the spirits of the hunt to guide their efforts and ensure their success. What the woman witnessed that night was knowledge that had been kept sacred for countless generations. Rituals that connected the Cherokee people to the very essence of life and death in the natural world. She saw the men transform themselves spiritually, taking on the characteristics of the animals they would hunt, communicating with spirits that existed beyond the physical realm, and wielding powers that were meant only for those who had been properly initiated and prepared through years of training and purification. The knowledge was intoxicating, filling her with a sense of power and understanding that she had never experienced before. But it was knowledge that came with a terrible price. The spirits that governed the hunting rituals were ancient and powerful entities that had established the sacred laws for reasons that went far beyond human understanding. These spirits could sense the presence of the unauthorized observer, and they were filled with rage at the violation of their most sacred commandments. As the woman watched from her hiding place, wrapped in the mountain cat's hide, the spirits began to work their terrible justice upon her. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as the cat hide seemed to merge with her own skin, becoming part of her rather than simply covering her. At first, the woman felt only a strange tingling sensation, as if the hide was somehow alive and responding to her presence. But as the ritual continued and her violation of the sacred laws became more complete, the transformation accelerated dramatically. Her fingernails began to grow into sharp claws, her teeth elongated into fangs, and her spine began to curve and stretch as her body took on the characteristics of the mountain cat, whose hide she wore. Most terrifying of all, her mind began to change as well, as human thoughts and emotions were gradually replaced by the instincts and drives of a wild predator. By the time the hunting ritual was complete and the men began to disperse, the woman's transformation was irreversible. She was no longer human, but neither was she truly an animal. She had become something caught between the two worlds, a creature that possessed the worst characteristics of both. The spirits had cursed her to spend eternity as a warning to others who might be tempted to violate the sacred laws, transforming her into a monster that would forever patrol the boundaries between the human and spirit worlds, ensuring that such transgressions never occurred again. The newly created Wampus Cat retained enough of her human intelligence to understand what had happened to her, and to feel the full weight of her eternal punishment. She was condemned to wander the mountains forever, neither fully human nor fully animal, unable to return to her tribe or to find peace in death. Her appearance was terrifying to behold. A creature that stood upright like a human, but possessed the body, claws, and fangs of a massive mountain cat, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence, and a voice that could produce both human speech and the terrifying screams of a wild predator. The Cherokee people who encountered the Wampus Cat in the years following her transformation reported that she would appear to hunters who were preparing to violate sacred laws or who showed disrespect for the spiritual aspects of the hunt. She served as both a warning and an enforcer, using her terrifying appearance and supernatural abilities to ensure that the ancient traditions were maintained and respected. Some accounts describe her as being capable of moving with impossible speed and stealth, appearing and disappearing at will, and possessing strength far beyond that of any natural animal. When European settlers began arriving in the Appalachian region in the 18th and 19th centuries, they brought their own folklore and superstitions, which gradually merged with the Cherokee traditions to create new versions of the Wampus Cat legend. The settlers, who had their own traditions of werewolves, witches, and shapeshifters, found the Cherokee story of the cursed woman to be both familiar and terrifying. They adapted the legend to fit their own cultural context, often portraying the Wampus Cat as a witch who had been transformed as punishment for practicing dark magic or consorting with evil spirits. These European-influenced versions of the legend often emphasize different aspects of the creature's nature and behavior. Some stories portrayed the Wampus Cat as a malevolent entity that actively hunted humans, particularly those who ventured into the deep woods alone at night. Other accounts described it as a more neutral force that would only attack those who threatened the natural balance of the forest or who showed disrespect for the wilderness and its inhabitants. Regardless of the specific details, all versions of the legend agreed that the Wampus Cat was a creature to be feared and avoided at all costs. The most significant documented encounter with what may have been the Wampus Cat occurred in the 1960s in the hills around Goldsboro, North Carolina, when multiple witnesses reported seeing a large, ape-like creature that displayed characteristics consistent with the traditional descriptions of the Wampus Cat. The Goldsboro Argus newspaper covered the story extensively, describing a creature that stood upright like a human, but was covered in dark fur and possessed the agility and strength of a large predator. The sightings attracted national attention and prompted an official search by local authorities, though the creature was never captured or definitively identified. What made the Goldsboro sightings particularly significant was the consistency of the witness descriptions and the fact that many of the observers were unfamiliar with the Cherokee legend of the Wampus Cat. The witnesses described a creature that matched the traditional accounts almost perfectly, suggesting that they had encountered something that was either the actual legendary creature or something very similar to it. The sightings continued for several weeks before the creature apparently moved on or disappeared, leaving behind only footprints, damaged vegetation, and the testimony of dozens of frightened witnesses. Robert Bushyhead, a Cherokee historian and cultural expert, has spent decades studying the Wampus Cat legend and its significance within Cherokee spiritual tradition. According to Bushyhead, the story of the Wampus Cat serves multiple purposes within Cherokee culture. It reinforces the importance of respecting sacred boundaries, warns against the dangers of forbidden knowledge, and illustrates the consequences that can result from violating spiritual laws. The legend also serves as a reminder that there are forces in the natural world that are beyond human understanding and control, forces that demand respect and reverence. from those who would interact with them. Bushyhead emphasizes that the Cherokee understanding of the Wampus Cat is fundamentally different from the European-influenced versions of the legend that became popular among settlers and their descendants. For the Cherokee, the Wampus Cat is not simply a monster or a threat to be feared, but a tragic figure whose suffering serves as a constant reminder of the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the spirit world. The creature's eternal punishment is seen as both just and necessary, a consequence of her own choices, but also a sacrifice that helps to protect the spiritual integrity of the entire community. The psychological and cultural impact of the Wampus Cat legend extends far beyond its role as a simple cautionary tale. The story addresses fundamental questions about gender roles, forbidden knowledge, and the price of curiosity that resonate across cultural boundaries. The woman's transformation can be seen as a metaphor for the dangers of transgressing social and spiritual boundaries, but it can also be interpreted as a commentary on the restrictions placed on women's access to knowledge and power in traditional societies. Modern researchers and folklorists have noted that the Wampus Cat legend shares common elements with transformation myths from cultures around the world, suggesting that it taps into universal human fears and anxieties about the boundaries between civilization and wildness, human and animal, male and female. The story's enduring popularity and its ability to adapt to different cultural contexts demonstrate its power as both entertainment and moral instruction. The legend has also influenced modern cryptid research and paranormal investigation in the Appalachian region. Researchers who study reports of unknown creatures in the mountains often compare new sightings to the traditional descriptions of the Wampus Cat, looking for connections between contemporary encounters and ancient folklore. Some investigators believe that the Wampus Cat legend may be based on encounters with real, unknown animals that inhabit the remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains, while others see it as evidence of supernatural or interdimensional phenomena that transcend conventional understanding. The environmental and ecological aspects of the Wampus Cat legend are also significant, as the story emphasizes the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the natural world and respecting the spiritual dimensions of hunting and wildlife management. In an era of increasing environmental awareness and concern about the impact of human activities on natural ecosystems, the Cherokee understanding of the Wampus Cat as a guardian of natural law takes on new relevance and meaning. Contemporary Cherokee communities continue to preserve and share the Wampus Cat legend as part of their cultural heritage, using it to teach younger generations about the importance of respecting traditional values and spiritual practices. The story serves as a bridge between the ancient wisdom of their ancestors and the challenges of modern life, reminding Cherokee people of their responsibilities to maintain the spiritual and cultural traditions that have sustained their communities for thousands of years. The Wampus Cat legend also raises important questions about the nature of punishment, redemption, and eternal consequences. The woman's transformation is portrayed as permanent and irreversible, suggesting that some violations of spiritual law are so serious that they cannot be forgiven or undone. This aspect of the legend reflects a worldview in which actions have permanent consequences and in which the spiritual realm operates according to laws that are absolute and unchanging. For those who study Appalachian folklore and supernatural phenomena, the Wampus Cat represents one of the most complex and multi-layered legends in the region's rich tradition of mysterious creatures and unexplained encounters. The story combines elements of Native American spirituality, European folklore, and contemporary cryptid research in ways that create a narrative that is both ancient and modern, both culturally specific and universally relevant. The enduring power of the Wampus Cat legend lies not just in its ability to frighten and entertain, but in its capacity to convey important truths about the human condition and our relationship with forces beyond our understanding. Whether one believes in the literal existence of the creature or sees it as a powerful metaphor for the consequences of transgressing sacred boundaries, the Wampus Cat continues to serve as a reminder that there are mysteries in our world that demand respect, caution, and humility from those who would seek to understand them. As we continue to explore the supernatural heritage of the Appalachian Mountains, the Wampus Cat stands as a testament to the enduring power of ancient wisdom and the importance of preserving the spiritual traditions that connect us to the deepest mysteries of existence. In a world that often seems to have lost touch with the sacred dimensions of life, the legend of the cursed woman who became a monster serves as both a warning and an invitation. A warning about the dangers of violating spiritual laws, and an invitation to approach the mysteries of existence with the respect and reverence they deserve. Moving to our sixth story, we venture into the dark hollows of Clay County, West Virginia, where around the year 1900, a tale unfolded that would become one of the most chilling accounts of witchcraft and supernatural retribution in Appalachian history. This isn't merely a story about folk magic or mountain superstitions. This is a documented case of a woman who allegedly made a pact with the devil himself, and the terrifying consequences that followed when her dark powers were exposed to the light of day. The story of the Witch of Booger Hole represents the intersection of ancient folk beliefs, community justice, and supernatural forces that still haunts the remote valleys of West Virginia to this day. Otter Creek winds through some of the most isolated and mysterious terrain in all of West Virginia, carving deep valleys between steep mountain ridges that seem to hold secrets in their shadowed depths. It was along this creek, in a place that locals had long called Booger Hole, a name that itself suggests the supernatural reputation of the area, that a young woman named Ira came to live after marrying into the Thorne family around 1900. The Thornes were an established mountain family with a reputation that extended far beyond their immediate community. But it was a reputation built on fear rather than respect. For generations, the Thorne family had been whispered about in the surrounding hollows, with stories passed down through families about their involvement in dark practices and their alleged ability to commune with forces that decent folk avoided at all costs. The matriarch of the Thorne family was known simply as Grandma Thorne, an elderly woman whose very presence seemed to cast a shadow over everything around her. She was described by those who knew her as having an otherworldly appearance, eyes that seemed to see too much, hands that were always cold to the touch, and a voice that could make children cry just by speaking their names. Grandma Thorne lived in a cabin deep in the woods along Otter Creek, far from the main roads and settlements, in a place where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor, even at midday. It was a location that seemed perfectly suited to someone who preferred to conduct her business away from prying eyes and curious neighbors. When young Ira married into the Thorne family, she quickly discovered that her new relatives were involved in practices that went far beyond the traditional folk magic and herbal remedies that were common throughout the Appalachian region. Grandma Thorne was widely believed throughout Clay County to be a genuine witch, someone who had made an actual pact with the devil in exchange for supernatural powers that allowed her to curse her enemies, predict future events, and manipulate the natural world in ways that defied all rational explanation. The old woman made no attempt to hide her reputation or deny the accusations. In fact, she seemed to take pride in the fear and respect that her alleged powers commanded throughout the community. The stories about Grandma Thorne's supernatural abilities were numerous and consistently terrifying. Local residents reported that she could curse livestock, causing healthy animals to sicken and die within days of crossing her. Farmers claimed that she could blight crops with a single glance, turning thriving fields into withered wastelands overnight. Most frightening of all were the accounts of her ability to harm people from a distance, causing mysterious illnesses, accidents, and misfortunes to befall anyone who dared to oppose her or speak against her publicly. These weren't just superstitious fears or coincidental events. The pattern of misfortune that followed those who crossed Grandma Thorne was so consistent and dramatic that even skeptics began to take notice. The most chilling aspect of Grandma Thorne's reputation, however, was the story of how she had allegedly acquired her supernatural powers in the first place. According to local legend, which was documented years later by Professor Patrick Gaynor of West Virginia University during his extensive folklore research in the 1970s, Grandma Thorne had climbed to the top of a high hill overlooking Otter Creek on a night when the moon was dark and the stars seemed dimmed by supernatural forces. There, in a ritual that violated every principle of Christian faith and human decency, she had cursed God 3 times, calling upon the devil to witness her blasphemy and accept her soul in exchange for the power to work her will upon the world. The ritual, as described by those who claim to have knowledge of it, involved Grandma Thorne firing a gun through a white handkerchief at the sun, an act that was said to represent her rejection of divine light and her embrace of darkness. According to the legend, when the gun was fired, the handkerchief began to bleed real blood, a sign that the devil had accepted her offering and granted her the supernatural powers she sought. From that moment forward, Grandma Thorne was no longer merely human. She had become something else, a creature that existed in the space between the natural and supernatural worlds, wielding powers that came with a terrible price. The community around Otter Creek lived in constant fear of Grandma Thorne and her alleged supernatural abilities, but they also maintained an uneasy peace with her, understanding that direct confrontation with someone who possessed such powers would likely result in terrible consequences for anyone brave or foolish enough to challenge her. This delicate balance was maintained for years, with local residents giving the Thorne family a wide berth and avoiding any actions that might provoke the old woman's wrath. However, this fragile peace was shattered when a local man named Samuel Morrison disappeared under mysterious circumstances that would ultimately expose the full extent of Grandma Thorne's dark knowledge. Samuel Morrison was a well-respected member of the community, a family man and hard worker who had no known enemies and no reason to simply vanish without a trace. When he failed to return home from a trip to town one evening, his family and friends organized search parties that scoured the mountains and valleys for miles around, looking for any sign of what might have happened to him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but no trace of Samuel Morrison was ever found. No body, no clothing, no evidence of what had become of him or where he might have gone. The mystery of Samuel Morrison's disappearance might have remained unsolved indefinitely, joining the ranks of countless other unexplained vanishings that had occurred in the remote mountains over the years. However, Grandma Thorne made a fatal error that would ultimately lead to her downfall. She demonstrated knowledge about Morrison's fate that she could not possibly have possessed through normal means. In conversations with neighbors and family members, the old woman made comments that suggested she knew exactly what had happened to the missing man and where his remains could be found. When pressed for details about her knowledge of Morrison's disappearance, Grandma Thorne initially tried to deflect suspicion by claiming that her information came from supernatural sources. visions granted to her by the dark forces she served, or messages received through her alleged ability to communicate with the spirits of the dead. However, her explanations only served to increase suspicion about her involvement in Morrison's fate, and community members began to whisper that the old witch had finally gone too far and committed a crime that could not be overlooked or forgiven. The situation reached a breaking point when Grandma Thorne, perhaps overconfident in her reputation and the fear she inspired, made the mistake of revealing specific details about Morrison's disappearance that only someone directly involved in his fate could have known. She described the exact location where his body could be found, details about his final moments, and information about what had been done with his remains that went far beyond what could be explained by supernatural visions or spirit communication. Her knowledge was too detailed, too specific, and too accurate to be anything other than first-hand information about a crime. Within a week of Grandma Thorne's revelations about Samuel Morrison's fate, the old woman was found dead in her cabin, killed by a single gunshot fired through her window while she slept. The killing was swift, efficient, and clearly the work of someone who had planned the attack carefully and executed it with deadly precision. No one in the community claimed responsibility for the shooting, and no official investigation was ever conducted, but the message was clear. Grandma Thorne's reign of terror had come to an end, and justice had been served in the only way that the isolated mountain community knew how to deliver it. The circumstances surrounding Grandma Thorne's death raised as many questions as they answered. While it was clear that she had been killed by someone in the community who had grown tired of living in fear of her alleged supernatural powers, the identity of her killer remained a mystery that was never solved. Some residents suspected that it was a family member of Samuel Morrison, seeking revenge for whatever role the old woman had played in his disappearance. Others believed that it was a coordinated effort by multiple community members who had decided that the threat posed by Grandma Thorne was too great to be allowed to continue. What made the killing particularly significant, however, was the timing and the apparent ease with which it was accomplished. For years, Grandma Thorne had been feared throughout the region for her alleged supernatural powers and her ability to curse or harm anyone who opposed her. The fact that she could be killed so easily, with no apparent supernatural retaliation or protection, suggested to many that her powers had either been greatly exaggerated or had somehow been stripped away from her when she revealed too much about her involvement in Morrison's disappearance. Professor Patrick Gaynor's documentation of the Witch of Booger Hole case in the 1970s was based on interviews with people who had actually lived through these events, or who had heard first-hand accounts from family members who were present during the time period. Gaynor's research revealed that the story was not merely a piece of folklore or legend, but was based on real events that had occurred in Clay County around 1900. His interviews with elderly residents of the area confirmed many of the details of the story and provided additional information about the social and cultural context in which these events had taken place. According to Gaynor's research, the Witch of Booger Hole case represented a classic example of how isolated mountain communities dealt with individuals who were perceived as threats to the social order and community safety. In a time and place where formal law enforcement was virtually non-existent and where people had to rely on their own resources for protection and justice, the killing of Grandma Thorne was seen not as murder, but as a necessary act of community self-defense against someone who had used fear and intimidation to terrorize her neighbors for years. The case also illustrated the complex relationship between folk beliefs, supernatural fears, and practical concerns that characterized life in the Appalachian Mountains during this period. While many residents genuinely believed in Grandma Thorne's supernatural powers and feared her ability to curse or harm them, they also recognized that her knowledge of Samuel Morrison's disappearance suggested involvement in a very real and very serious crime. The decision to kill her was based not just on superstitious fears, but on the practical understanding that she posed a genuine threat to the safety and well-being of the community. The location where these events took place, the area known as Booger Hole along Otter Creek, continued to have a sinister reputation long after Grandma Thorne's death. Local residents reported strange occurrences in the area, including unexplained lights, mysterious sounds, and feelings of unease that seemed to permeate the landscape around the old Thorne cabin. Some people claimed to have seen the ghost of Grandma Thorne wandering the creek banks at night, still searching for revenge against those who had ended her life and exposed her secrets. The psychological impact of the Witch of Booger Hole case on the local community was profound and long-lasting. The events had demonstrated that even the most feared and powerful individuals could be brought down when they went too far and threatened the fundamental safety and security of their neighbors. However, the case also reinforced beliefs about the reality of supernatural forces and the dangers of becoming involved with dark powers that could ultimately lead to destruction and death. Modern researchers who have studied the case have noted that it contains elements that are common to witch persecution throughout history: the accusation of supernatural powers, the attribution of unexplained misfortunes to magical causes, and the ultimate violent resolution when the accused individual was perceived as having gone too far. However, the Booger Hole case is unusual in that the alleged witch was not killed because of her supposed supernatural abilities, but because she revealed knowledge of a crime that suggested her involvement in very real and very serious wrongdoing. The case also raises important questions about the nature of justice in isolated communities and the ways in which people respond to threats that cannot be addressed through conventional legal channels. In a time and place where formal law enforcement was essentially non-existent, the killing of Grandma Thorne represented a form of frontier justice that was both brutal and effective in removing a perceived threat to community safety. The story of the Witch of Booger Hole continues to be told in Clay County and throughout West Virginia, serving as both entertainment and moral instruction for new generations of mountain residents. The tale reminds listeners about the dangers of becoming involved with dark forces and the ultimate consequences that await those who use fear and intimidation to control their neighbors. It also serves as a reminder that even the most powerful and feared individuals are not beyond the reach of justice. When they cross certain lines and threaten the fundamental safety and security of their communities. For those who study Appalachian folklore and supernatural traditions, the Witch of Booger Hole case represents one of the most complex and morally ambiguous stories in the region's rich tradition of witchcraft and supernatural encounters. The story combines elements of genuine folk belief, criminal activity, and community justice in ways that create a narrative that is both historically significant and deeply unsettling. Whether one believes in the reality of Grandma Thorne's supernatural powers or sees them as elaborate deceptions used to intimidate and control her neighbors, the case remains a powerful reminder of the dark currents that have always flowed beneath the surface of life in the isolated mountains and hollows of Appalachia. Moving to our seventh story, we enter the realm of documented religious supernatural phenomena, where faith, death, and divine intervention converged in one of the most thoroughly investigated and officially recognized hauntings in American Catholic history. The Priestfield Haunting of the 1790s stands as a unique case where supernatural terror was not only witnessed by multiple credible sources, but was ultimately resolved through religious ritual. creating a permanent monument to the power of proper spiritual observance and the consequences of denying the sacred rites to the dying. This extraordinary case unfolded in the easternmost corner of West Virginia, near Opequon Creek, on land that would eventually become one of the most spiritually significant locations in the region. Adam Livingston was a prosperous Protestant farmer who had built a successful life for himself and his family on their property near what is now Charlestown, West Virginia. The Livingstons were respected members of their community, known for their hard work, honest dealings, and practical approach to life that left little room for superstition or supernatural beliefs. Adam was a man who trusted in tangible things: good soil, hard work, and the Protestant faith that had sustained his family for generations. He had no particular animosity toward Catholics, but like many Protestants of his era, he viewed Catholic rituals and beliefs with skepticism and considered many of their practices to be unnecessary superstitions that had no basis in true Christian faith. The events that would transform the Livingston family's peaceful existence began on a cold winter evening in the early 1790s when a stranger appeared at their door, seeking shelter from the harsh weather that was sweeping across the Virginia countryside. The man was clearly ill, weakened by travel and suffering from what appeared to be a serious fever that left him barely able to stand. Following the mountain tradition of hospitality that was sacred throughout the region, the Livingstons immediately welcomed the stranger into their home, providing him with food, warmth, and a comfortable place to rest while he recovered from his illness. As the stranger's condition worsened over the following days, it became clear that he was not merely suffering from a common illness, but was, in fact, dying. In his lucid moments, the man revealed that he was a devout Catholic and expressed his desperate desire to receive the last rites of his church before he passed away. He begged the Livingstons to send for a Catholic priest who could perform the sacred rituals that would prepare his soul for the journey into the afterlife and ensure his eternal salvation according to the beliefs he had held throughout his life. Adam Livingston found himself in a difficult position. While he felt genuine compassion for the dying stranger and wanted to help him in any way possible, he also harbored deep skepticism about Catholic rituals and their supposed spiritual significance. Livingston believed that such ceremonies were unnecessary superstitions that had no real power or meaning, and he was reluctant to go to the considerable trouble and expense of locating and bringing a Catholic priest to his remote farm for what he considered to be an empty ritual. The nearest Catholic priest was many miles away, and the journey would be dangerous in the winter weather, requiring significant time and resources that Livingston was hesitant to commit. Despite the stranger's increasingly desperate pleas for spiritual assistance, Livingston made the fateful decision to deny his request for a Catholic priest. He attempted to comfort the dying man by offering Protestant prayers and spiritual consolation, genuinely believing that these would be sufficient to provide the spiritual comfort that the stranger sought. However, the stranger continued to beg for Catholic last rites until his final breath, dying in a state of spiritual anguish and despair that filled the Livingston household with an atmosphere of profound sadness and unease. The stranger was buried on the Livingston property in what seemed to be a respectful and proper manner, with Protestant prayers offered over his grave and a simple marker erected to commemorate his passing. For a brief time, life returned to normal for the Livingston family, and Adam felt that he had done everything that could reasonably be expected of him under the circumstances. However, this period of normalcy was short-lived, as supernatural phenomena began manifesting on the property almost immediately after the stranger's burial. phenomena that would escalate into one of the most terrifying and well-documented hauntings in American history. The first signs of supernatural activity were subtle, but deeply unsettling. Family members began hearing strange noises throughout the house at night. Sounds of footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing on their own, and mysterious tapping or scratching sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. These disturbances were initially dismissed as the normal settling sounds of an old house, or perhaps the activities of mice or other small animals. But they quickly escalated in both frequency and intensity, making it impossible to ignore their supernatural nature. Within weeks of the stranger's death, the phenomena had become impossible to rationalize away. Objects began moving on their own throughout the house, with furniture sliding across floors, dishes flying off tables, and personal belongings disappearing only to reappear in impossible locations. The family would wake in the morning to find their possessions scattered throughout the house as if an invisible intruder had ransacked their home during the night. Most disturbing of all, mysterious fires began breaking out spontaneously throughout the property, appearing without any apparent source of ignition and burning in ways that defied the normal laws of combustion. These supernatural fires were particularly terrifying because they seemed to target specific objects and areas of the house, while leaving adjacent materials completely untouched. Clothing would burst into flames while hanging in closets, yet the wooden closet itself would remain unburned. Papers would ignite on desks, while the wooden desk surface showed no signs of heat damage. The fires would appear suddenly, burn intensely for a brief period, and then extinguish themselves just as mysteriously as they had begun, leaving behind only the charred remains of their targets and the acrid smell of smoke that seemed to linger in the air for days. As the supernatural activity intensified, Mrs. Livingston began to suffer from a mysterious illness that seemed to have no natural cause or cure. She experienced severe weakness, persistent fever, and episodes of delirium that left her bedridden and unable to care for her family. Local doctors were baffled by her condition, as she displayed symptoms that didn't match any known disease, and none of their treatments seemed to provide any relief. The illness seemed to be directly connected to the supernatural phenomena plaguing the household, as her condition would worsen whenever the paranormal activity was at its most intense. The Livingston family's ordeal continued for months, with the supernatural phenomena showing no signs of diminishing. Word of their plight spread throughout the local community, attracting curious visitors who came to witness the extraordinary events for themselves. Many of these visitors left as believers, having personally observed furniture moving without human intervention, objects appearing and disappearing, and the mysterious fires that seemed to burn according to their own supernatural logic rather than the natural laws of physics. The psychological toll on the Livingston family was enormous. They lived in constant fear and uncertainty, never knowing when the next supernatural manifestation would occur or what form it might take. Sleep became nearly impossible as the disturbances continued throughout the night, and the family's daily routines were constantly disrupted by the unpredictable paranormal activity. Adam Livingston, who had always prided himself on his rational, practical approach to life, found his worldview completely shattered by events that defied all logical explanation. It was during this period of intense supernatural terror that Adam Livingston experienced a prophetic dream that would ultimately provide the key to resolving the haunting. In this vivid and emotionally powerful dream, Livingston saw a Catholic priest dressed in black robes approaching his property. The priest in the dream had a kind but serious demeanor and seemed to radiate an aura of spiritual authority and peace that immediately calmed the supernatural chaos surrounding the Livingston home. The dream was so realistic and emotionally compelling that Livingston woke with the absolute conviction that this vision represented the solution to his family's supernatural ordeal. Following the guidance provided by his prophetic dream, Adam Livingston began searching for a Catholic priest who matched the description of the figure he had seen in his vision. His search led him to Father Dennis Cahill, a Catholic priest whose appearance and demeanor exactly matched the priest from Livingston's dream. When Livingston approached Father Cahill and explained the supernatural phenomena plaguing his household, the priest immediately understood the spiritual significance of what had occurred and agreed to come to the Livingston property to perform the proper Catholic burial rites for the deceased stranger. Father Cahill's arrival at the Livingston farm marked the beginning of the end of the supernatural haunting. The priest conducted a thorough investigation of the phenomena, interviewing family members and witnesses, examining the physical evidence of the supernatural activity, and spending time in prayer and meditation to understand the spiritual dimensions of the situation. Father Cahill concluded that the stranger spirit was indeed responsible for the haunting, trapped in a state of spiritual unrest because he had been denied the Catholic last rites that were essential for his soul's peaceful transition to the afterlife. The resolution of the Priestfield Haunting came when Father Cahill performed the proper Catholic burial ceremony for the deceased stranger, providing the spiritual rites that had been denied to him in life. The ceremony was conducted with full Catholic ritual and solemnity, including prayers for the dead, blessings for the deceased soul, and the proper consecration of his burial site according to Catholic tradition. The moment the ceremony was completed, all supernatural activity on the Livingston property ceased immediately and permanently, as if a spiritual switch had been turned off. The transformation was as dramatic as it was immediate. Mrs. Livingston's mysterious illness disappeared completely, and she made a full recovery within days of Father Cahill's intervention. The supernatural fires stopped occurring, objects remained in their proper places, and the strange noises that had plagued the household for months fell silent. The atmosphere of the entire property changed from one of fear and unease to one of peace and tranquility, as if the very land itself had been spiritually cleansed and restored. The profound impact of this experience on Adam Livingston cannot be overstated. The man who had once dismissed Catholic rituals as meaningless superstitions had witnessed firsthand the power of proper spiritual observance and the terrible consequences that could result from denying sacred rites to the dying. Livingston's transformation was complete and permanent. He converted to Catholicism and became one of the most devoted supporters of the Catholic Church in the region for the rest of his life. In gratitude for Father Cahill's intervention and in recognition of the spiritual significance of what had occurred on his property, Adam Livingston made an extraordinary gesture that would have lasting impact on the region's religious landscape. He donated 38 acres of his land to the Catholic Church, specifically requesting that the property be used for religious purposes that would honor the memory of the stranger whose spiritual needs had been so tragically neglected. This generous donation became the foundation for what would eventually become Priestfield, a Catholic retreat center and place of pilgrimage that continues to serve the faithful to this day. The Priestfield haunting case was extensively documented by Catholic Church officials and became part of the official record of supernatural phenomena recognized by the Church. Father Michael Russo, a Catholic historian who has studied the case extensively, notes that the Priestfield haunting represents one of the clearest examples of how proper spiritual observance can resolve supernatural disturbances and bring peace to restless souls. The case also demonstrates the Catholic Church's understanding of the connection between proper burial rites and the spiritual welfare of the deceased. The documentation of the Priestfield haunting includes detailed accounts from multiple witnesses, official church records, and the testimony of the Livingston family members who experienced the phenomena firsthand. These records provide a comprehensive picture of the supernatural events and their resolution, making the case one of the most thoroughly documented religious hauntings in American history. The consistency of the witness accounts and the dramatic nature of the resolution have made the Priestfield haunting a subject of ongoing study and discussion among both religious scholars and paranormal researchers. Even today, more than 2 centuries after the original events, visitors to Priestfield continue to report unusual experiences that may be connected to the site's supernatural history. Some guests at the retreat center have reported hearing unexplained sounds, particularly what sounds like scissors or shears cutting through fabric, a phenomenon that connects to one of the most persistent aspects of the original haunting. During the height of the supernatural activity, the Livingston family frequently found their clothing and household linens cut into crescent moon shapes by invisible forces, a manifestation that seemed to be one of the stranger's spirit's ways of making its presence known. The crescent moon cutting phenomenon was one of the most distinctive and puzzling aspects of the Priestfield haunting. Family members would retire for the evening with their clothing intact, only to wake in the morning to find that garments had been cut into perfect crescent shapes while they slept. The cuts were always precise and uniform, made with what appeared to be extremely sharp scissors or shears. Yet no cutting implements were ever found, and no human intruder could have accomplished such work without waking the household. This particular manifestation continued even after Father Cahill's intervention, though with much less frequency, and some visitors to modern-day Priestfield report finding similar crescent-shaped cuts in their clothing after staying overnight at the retreat center. The theological implications of the Priestfield haunting have been the subject of extensive discussion and analysis within Catholic scholarly circles. The case provides what many consider to be compelling evidence for the Catholic doctrine regarding the importance of last rites and proper burial ceremonies for the spiritual welfare of the deceased. The fact that the haunting was completely resolved through the performance of proper Catholic rituals supports the Church's teaching about the real spiritual significance of these ceremonies and their power to affect the condition of souls in the afterlife. The Priestfield case also raises important questions about the relationship between different Christian denominations and their varying approaches to death and burial rituals. Adam Livingston's initial dismissal of Catholic last rites as unnecessary superstition reflects the Protestant skepticism toward Catholic practices that was common during this historical period. However, the supernatural consequences of denying these rites to the dying stranger suggest that such rituals may have genuine spiritual significance that transcends denominational differences and theological disputes. Modern paranormal researchers who have studied the Priestfield haunting note that it contains many elements that are consistent with other well-documented cases of supernatural activity related to improper burial or unfinished spiritual business. The pattern of escalating phenomena, the connection between the haunting and a specific deceased individual, and the resolution through appropriate religious intervention all fit established patterns in paranormal research. However, the Priestfield case is unusual in the completeness of its documentation and the dramatic nature of its resolution. The psychological and emotional impact of the Priestfield haunting on all those involved was profound and lasting. For the Livingston family, the experience represented a complete transformation of their understanding of spiritual reality and the importance of religious observance. Adam Livingston's conversion to Catholicism was not merely an intellectual decision, but a deeply personal response to having witnessed the power of Catholic spiritual practices to resolve supernatural disturbances and bring peace to troubled souls. The case also had a significant impact on the broader community, serving as a powerful testimony to the reality of supernatural phenomena and the importance of treating the dying with proper spiritual care, regardless of their religious background. The story of the Priestfield Haunting was passed down through generations of local families, serving as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of denying spiritual comfort to the dying and an inspiring example of how faith and proper religious observance can overcome even the most terrifying supernatural manifestations. For contemporary visitors to Priestfield, the site serves as a place of spiritual reflection and renewal, where the dramatic events of the 1790s continue to inspire faith and devotion among those who come to pray and meditate. The Retreat Center offers programs and activities that help visitors connect with the spiritual significance of the location, while also learning about the historical events that led to its establishment. Many guests report feeling a profound sense of peace and spiritual presence at Priestfield, as if the resolution of the original haunting created a lasting atmosphere of divine blessing and protection. The Priestfield Haunting remains one of the most compelling and well-documented cases of religious supernatural phenomena in American history, offering valuable insights into the relationship between faith, death, and the afterlife. Whether one approaches the case from a religious perspective that accepts the literal truth of the supernatural events, or from a more skeptical viewpoint that seeks natural explanations for the reported phenomena, the Priestfield Haunting continues to challenge our understanding of the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, and the power of religious faith to address the deepest mysteries of human existence. Moving to our eighth story, we descend into the dark underground world of Appalachian coal mining, where the pursuit of black gold has carved countless tunnels through the ancient mountains, some of which seem to lead not just deeper into the earth, but into realms that were never meant for human exploration. The mining shaft disappearances represent one of the most persistent and terrifying patterns of supernatural activity in the region, where experienced miners who knew these tunnels like the back of their hands would venture into familiar passages and simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions, grief, and the growing conviction among mining communities that certain shafts had become gateways to something far more sinister than anyone dared to imagine. Coal mining has been the lifeblood of Appalachian communities for over a century, drawing generations of families into the dangerous but necessary work of extracting the region's vast mineral wealth from deep beneath the mountains. These miners developed an intimate knowledge of the underground world, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated safe passages from dangerous ones, understanding the complex geology that could mean the difference between life and death, and developing an almost supernatural sense for the moods and dangers of the mines they worked in and daily. They were practical men who dealt with tangible dangers, cave-ins, gas leaks, flooding, and equipment failures, and had little patience for superstition or supernatural explanations for the hazards they faced in their daily work. However, even the most skeptical and experienced miners began to acknowledge that certain shafts throughout the region had developed reputations that went far beyond normal mining dangers. These were tunnels where men would enter and never emerge, where search parties would find no trace of missing workers despite thorough investigations, and where the very air seemed to carry an oppressive weight that made even veteran miners reluctant to venture too far into their depths. The disappearances followed no logical pattern related to known mining hazards. They occurred in shafts that were structurally sound, well ventilated, and free from the gas accumulations or water infiltration that typically caused mining accidents. Harold Jenkins represents the voice of countless miners who witnessed these inexplicable disappearances firsthand during his decades of work in the coal fields of West Virginia and Kentucky. Jenkins, now in his 80s, worked in mines throughout the region from the 1960s through the 1990s, and his weathered hands and coal-stained lungs bear testimony to a lifetime spent in the underground world that most people never see. When he speaks about the mining shaft disappearances, his voice carries the weight of personal experience and the haunted knowledge of someone who has seen things that challenge everything he thought he knew about the world above and below ground. According to Jenkins and dozens of other miners who have shared their experiences over the years, there were certain shafts that every experienced miner learned to avoid, not because of any official safety warnings or documented hazards, but because of an unspoken understanding that had been passed down through generations of mining families. These were the tunnels where men had vanished without explanation, where strange sounds echoed from depths that seemed to extend far beyond what the geological surveys indicated, and where even the most hardened miners reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the passages themselves. One of the most documented cases of mining shaft disappearances occurred in the late 1970s at a coal operation in southern West Virginia, where two experienced miners, Robert Bobby Hutchinson and his nephew Michael Hutchinson, disappeared during what should have been a routine inspection of a newly opened section of tunnel. The Hutchinsons were part of a mining family that had worked the same general area for 3 generations, and both men knew the underground geography of the region better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Bobby, in particular, was known for his almost uncanny ability to navigate the complex network of tunnels and his reputation for never getting lost or disoriented underground. On the morning of their disappearance, Bobby and Michael had been assigned to inspect a section of tunnel that had been sealed off for several months due to minor structural concerns, but had recently been cleared for reopening by safety inspectors. The tunnel was well mapped, structurally sound, and showed no signs of the gas accumulations or water infiltration that typically made mining areas dangerous. The 2 men entered the shaft at approximately 7:30 a.m., carrying standard safety equipment, including gas detectors, emergency oxygen supplies, and radio communication devices that would allow them to maintain contact with the surface crew throughout their inspection. The last radio contact with the Hutchinson men occurred at 9:15 a.m., when Bobby reported that they had completed their initial survey of the tunnel and were proceeding deeper into the shaft to check some areas that had not been fully inspected during the previous safety evaluation. His voice on the radio was calm and professional, showing no signs of distress or concern, and he estimated that they would complete their work and return to the surface within 2 hours. However, when the men failed to emerge from the tunnel by their scheduled time, and when repeated radio calls went unanswered, mine supervisors initiated emergency search procedures that would ultimately involve dozens of rescue workers and continue for over a week. The search for Bobby and Michael Hutchinson was one of the most extensive mining rescue operations ever conducted in the region, involving not only the mine's own safety personnel, but also specialized rescue teams from neighboring operations, state mining inspectors, and federal safety officials who brought sophisticated detection equipment to aid in the search. The rescue teams methodically explored every inch of the tunnel system, using gas detectors to check for dangerous accumulations that might have overcome the missing men, listening devices to detect any sounds that might indicate the location of trapped miners, and even bringing in specially trained rescue dogs to search for human scent in the underground passages. What the search teams discovered was far more disturbing than any conventional mining accident. The tunnel where the Hutchinson men had been working showed no signs of structural collapse, gas leaks, or flooding that could account for their disappearance. Their safety equipment was found scattered throughout the tunnel in a pattern that made no logical sense. Bobby's hard hat was discovered nearly a quarter-mile from where they had last reported their position. Michael's gas detector was found in a side passage that wasn't even part of their assigned inspection route. And their radio equipment was located in 3 different locations, as if it had been deliberately separated and distributed throughout the tunnel system. Most puzzling of all was the discovery that the tunnel seemed to extend much farther into the mountain than any of the geological surveys or mining maps indicated. The rescue teams found passages and chambers that appeared on no official documentation, tunnels that seemed to have been carved by some process other than conventional mining techniques, and areas where the rock formations and mineral deposits were unlike anything found elsewhere in the mine. Some of the rescue workers reported that these unexplored sections of the tunnel felt different from the rest of the mine. The air was colder. Sounds seemed to be absorbed rather than echoing normally. And several team members experienced feelings of disorientation and unease that made them reluctant to venture too far into these mysterious passages. The official investigation into the Hutchinson disappearance concluded that the men had likely become lost in an unmapped section of the tunnel system and had succumbed to unknown hazards, possibly including gas exposure or structural collapse in areas that were too dangerous for rescue teams to fully explore. However, this explanation satisfied no one who was familiar with Bobby Hutchinson's reputation and experience, and it failed to account for the strange distribution of the men's equipment or the discovery of tunnel sections that appeared on no mining company records or geological surveys. The Hutchinson case was far from unique in the annals of Appalachian mining history. Similar disappearances had been occurring for decades throughout the region, following patterns that were remarkably consistent despite occurring in different mines, different time periods, and involving different mining companies and safety protocols. The missing miners were invariably experienced workers who knew their assigned areas well. The disappearances occurred in tunnels that showed no signs of conventional mining hazards, and search efforts typically revealed evidence of unexplored passages or chambers that seemed to extend far beyond what official surveys indicated. Harold Jenkins recalls another case from his own experience in the early 1980s, when a miner named Thomas Garrett vanished from a shaft in eastern Kentucky under circumstances that were eerily similar to the Hutchinson disappearance. Garrett had been working alone in a section of tunnel that was considered completely safe and well understood, conducting routine maintenance on ventilation equipment that he had serviced dozens of times before. When he failed to report back at his scheduled time, Jenkins was part of the search team that went looking for him in the familiar tunnel where he had been working. What they found defied all logical explanation. Garrett's tools were scattered throughout the tunnel in a pattern that suggested he had been moving deeper into the mountain, rather than working on the ventilation equipment near the tunnel entrance where he had been assigned. His lunch pail was discovered in a side passage that Jenkins was certain had not existed the previous week, when he had worked in the same area. Most disturbing of all, the search team found footprints in the coal dust that seemed to show Garrett walking steadily deeper into the mountain, following passages that appeared to lead into sections of the mine that no one had ever explored or mapped. The search for Thomas Garrett continued for 5 days, with teams exploring every known section of the mine and even bringing in specialized equipment to detect any signs of life in areas that were too dangerous for human searchers to enter. However, no trace of Garrett was ever found beyond the scattered evidence of his passage deeper into the unexplored sections of the tunnel system. The official explanation was that he had become disoriented and lost in an unmapped area of the mine, but Jenkins and the other searchers knew that Garrett was far too experienced and familiar with the mine to simply get lost in tunnels he had worked in for years. The psychological impact of these disappearances on mining communities was profound and lasting. Miners who had spent their entire careers working underground began to develop an almost superstitious fear of certain shafts and tunnel sections, passing down warnings through informal networks that identified areas to be avoided regardless of official safety assessments. Families of miners lived with a constant fear that their loved ones might simply vanish during a routine shift, disappearing into tunnels that seemed to lead not just deeper into the earth, but into some realm beyond human understanding or reach. The mining companies, faced with unexplained disappearances that threatened both worker morale and operational efficiency, typically responded by sealing off tunnel sections where disappearances had occurred, officially citing safety concerns or economic factors that made continued operation of those areas impractical. However, miners and their families understood that these closures were really acknowledgments that certain parts of the underground world had become too dangerous to enter, not because of conventional mining hazards, but because of something far more mysterious and threatening. Jenkins recalls that the old-timers in the mining community had their own explanations for the disappearances, theories that were rooted in generations of underground experience and the accumulated wisdom of families who had worked the mines for decades. According to these veteran miners, some shafts went deeper than they should, extending into areas of the mountain that had never been touched by human activity and that connected to natural cave systems or geological formations that existed according to their own ancient rules rather than the mapped and surveyed world of commercial mining operations. The most disturbing theory, shared in whispered conversations in mining camps and company towns throughout the region, was that certain tunnels had somehow become gateways to places that were not meant for the living. These old-timers spoke of shafts that seemed to call to certain individuals, drawing them deeper into the mountain with a compulsion that could not be resisted or explained. They told stories of miners who had reported hearing voices calling their names from deep within unexplored passages, of tunnel sections where the air itself seemed to whisper and beckon, and of areas where experienced miners would become inexplicably disoriented and find themselves walking toward depths that seemed to extend infinitely into the heart of the mountain. The geological surveys and mining company records consistently failed to account for the tunnel sections where these disappearances occurred, as if these areas existed in some space between the official mapped world and the actual underground reality that miners encountered in their daily work. Rescue teams would discover passages that appeared on no blueprints, chambers that seemed to have been carved by processes that bore no resemblance to conventional mining techniques, and tunnel systems that extended far beyond what any geological survey had indicated was possible, given the known structure and composition of the mountain. Modern mining operations have largely moved away from the deep shaft mining that characterized the industry during the peak years of the disappearances, shifting towards surface mining techniques that avoid the need for extensive underground tunnel systems. However, some of the old shafts remain accessible, and contemporary explorers and researchers who have ventured into these abandoned mining areas continue to report experiences that echo the accounts of the missing miners from decades past. Urban explorers and paranormal investigators who have explored abandoned mining areas throughout Appalachia frequently report encountering tunnel sections that seem to extend much farther than official mining records indicate. Passages where normal acoustic properties seem to be suspended, and areas where electronic equipment malfunctions in ways that cannot be explained by conventional environmental factors. Some investigators have reported finding evidence of human presence in areas that should have been inaccessible for decades, including footprints in undisturbed coal dust and personal items that appear to have been recently placed, despite the fact that the mines have been officially closed for years. The mining shaft disappearances represent one of the most persistent and well-documented patterns of supernatural activity in Appalachian history. With cases spanning multiple decades, different mining operations, and various geographical locations throughout the region. The consistency of the disappearance patterns, the failure of conventional explanations to account for the missing miners, and the discovery of unexplored tunnel sections that appear on no official records all suggest that these cases involve something far more complex and mysterious than simple mining accidents or human error. For the families of the missing miners, the disappearances represent not just personal tragedies, but ongoing mysteries that have never been resolved or adequately explained. The lack of closure, combined with the supernatural elements surrounding the cases, has created a lasting legacy of grief and uncertainty that continues to affect mining communities throughout the region. Many families have never stopped hoping that their missing loved ones might somehow return from whatever realm they entered when they disappeared into those mysterious tunnels. While others have found what comfort they can in the belief that the missing miners have passed into some other existence where they are beyond the reach of earthly suffering. The mining shaft disappearances also serve as a reminder of the complex relationship between human industrial activity and the ancient geological forces that shape the Appalachian Mountains. The tunnels and shafts that miners carved into these mountains may have inadvertently opened pathways to areas that were never meant to be accessed by human beings, creating connections between the world of commercial mining and the deeper mysteries that lie hidden within the earth itself. Whether these disappearances represent encounters with unknown natural phenomena, supernatural forces, or something else entirely, they continue to challenge our understanding of what lies beneath the surface of the familiar world, and what dangers might await those who venture too far into the hidden depths of the ancient mountains. The legacy of the mining shaft disappearances continues to influence how people in Appalachian communities think about the relationship between human activity and the natural world, serving as a cautionary reminder that there are still places and forces in our world that demand respect, caution, and humility from those who would seek to explore or exploit them. For the miners who continue to work in the remaining underground operations throughout the region, the stories of the disappeared serve as both warning and memorial, ensuring that the memory of those who vanished into the mysterious depths will never be forgotten, and that future generations will approach the underground world with the reverence and caution that it demands. Moving to our ninth story, we venture into the picturesque mountain valley of Valle Crucis, North Carolina, where the serene beauty of rolling hills and ancient forests conceals one of the most persistent and terrifying supernatural guardians in all of Appalachia. The demon dog of Valle Crucis represents a phenomenon that has spanned generations, with consistent sightings of a massive, otherworldly canine that seems to serve as protector of the sacred ground surrounding St. John's Church Cemetery, a creature whose glowing red eyes and supernatural abilities have terrorized visitors and locals alike for over a century. This isn't simply another case of mistaken identity or exaggerated folklore. This is a documented pattern of encounters with an entity that appears to exist specifically to guard the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Valle Crucis, whose name means Valley of the Cross in Latin, sits nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, a place where Cherokee spiritual traditions merged with European Christian beliefs to create a unique spiritual landscape that seems to attract supernatural phenomena. The valley has been considered sacred ground for thousands of years, first by the Cherokee people who recognized the area's spiritual significance, and later by Christian settlers who established St. John's Church in the mid-1800s as a beacon of faith in the remote mountain wilderness. The church and its surrounding cemetery occupy a site that local Cherokee tradition identified as a place where the veil between worlds was particularly thin, a location where spirits could more easily cross between the physical and supernatural realms. St. John's Church itself is a modest but beautiful stone structure that was built in 1862 using local materials and traditional mountain craftsmanship. The church sits on a small rise overlooking the valley, surrounded by ancient oak and maple trees that create a natural cathedral of living pillars and leafy arches. The cemetery that surrounds the church contains graves dating back to the earliest European settlement of the area, with weathered headstones marking the final resting places of pioneers, farmers, and mountain families who carved out lives in this remote and challenging landscape. It is among these graves, in the shadows cast by the old trees and weathered monuments, that the demon dog has been seen countless times over the past century and a half. The first documented encounters with the demon dog date back to the late 1800s, when local residents began reporting sightings of an enormous black dog with glowing red eyes that appeared to patrol the cemetery grounds during the darkest hours of the night. Unlike ordinary dogs, this creature was described as being the size of a small horse, with a massive head, powerful shoulders, and eyes that burned with an inner fire that seemed to pierce through darkness and a fog alike. Witnesses consistently described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and supernatural terror when encountering the creature, as if they were in the presence of something that existed beyond the natural world and operated according to laws that human beings were not meant to understand. Dr. Rebecca Adams, a folklore researcher at Appalachian State University who has spent decades studying supernatural phenomena throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains, became interested in the Valle Crucis demon dog case in the late 1980s when two of her graduate students reported a terrifying encounter with the creature during a research trip to document local folklore and oral traditions. The students, Sarah Mitchell and David Thompson, had been conducting interviews with elderly residents of the valley about their memories of local legends and supernatural experiences when they decided to visit St. John's Church Cemetery to photograph some of the older headstones for their research project. According to their detailed report, which Dr. Adams has preserved in the university's folklore archives, Mitchell and Thompson arrived at the cemetery around 10 p.m. on a clear October night in 1987, equipped with cameras, flashlights, and recording equipment for documenting their findings. The cemetery was peaceful and quiet when they arrived, with only the sound of wind through the trees and the distant call of night birds breaking the mountain silence. The students spent about an hour photographing headstones and taking notes about the various family names and dates represented in the cemetery, working methodically through the older sections where the most historically significant graves were located. It was while they were examining a particularly old section of the cemetery, where graves dating to the 1860s and 1870s were clustered beneath a grove of ancient oak trees, that they first became aware of being watched. Both students later reported feeling an intense sensation of being observed, a prickling awareness that made the hair on their arms stand up and caused them to look around nervously for the source of their unease. At first, they saw nothing unusual, but as they continued their work, the feeling of being watched intensified until it became almost unbearable. The creature first appeared as a shadow moving between the headstones, a darkness that seemed somehow more solid and substantial than the ordinary shadows cast by trees and monuments in the moonlight. As Mitchell and Thompson watched in growing terror, the shadow began to take on a more definite form, revealing itself to be an enormous black dog that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. The creature's size was immediately apparent. It stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder and appeared to weigh several hundred pounds, with a massive head and powerful build that suggested strength far beyond that of any ordinary canine. But it was the creature's eyes that truly terrified the two students. As the demon dog turned its attention toward them, its eyes began to glow with a brilliant red light that seemed to burn with supernatural fire. The glow was not the simple reflection of light that might be seen in the eyes of a normal animal, but rather an internal illumination that pulsed and flickered like flames, casting an eerie red glow across the surrounding headstones and creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that made the entire cemetery seem to come alive with supernatural energy. The encounter lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes felt like hours to the terrified students. The demon dog stood perfectly still, watching them with its burning red eyes, while an oppressive silence settled over the cemetery that seemed to muffle even the sound of their own breathing. Neither student felt able to move or speak, as if the creature's presence had somehow paralyzed them with supernatural terror. The air around them grew noticeably colder, and both reported smelling a strange, sulfurous odor that seemed to emanate from the creature itself. The spell was finally broken when David Thompson managed to raise his camera and activate the flash, hoping to photograph the creature as evidence of their encounter. The bright flash seemed to startle or anger the demon dog, which let out a sound that the students described as being unlike anything they had ever heard. Not quite a bark or growl, but rather a deep, resonant howl that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than the creature's throat, a sound that vibrated through their bones and filled them with an even more intense fear than they had already been experiencing. Immediately after the flash and the creature's otherworldly howl, the demon dog began moving toward the students with a fluid, gliding motion that seemed to defy the normal laws of physics. The creature appeared to float rather than run, covering the distance between them with impossible speed while maintaining perfect silence except for that terrible howling sound that continued to echo through the cemetery. Faced with this supernatural pursuit, Mitchell and Thompson abandoned their equipment and fled the cemetery as fast as their legs could carry them, not stopping until they reached their car and could drive away from the haunted ground. When the students returned to the cemetery the next morning to retrieve their abandoned equipment, they found their cameras and recording devices scattered among the headstones. But the film in their cameras had been completely exposed and ruined, as if it had been subjected to intense light or radiation. More disturbing still, they discovered that several of their photographs from earlier in the evening, taken before their encounter with the demon dog, showed strange anomalies. Dark shapes moving between headstones, unexplained lights floating above graves, and in one particularly chilling image, what appeared to be the glowing red eyes of the creature watching them from the shadows, even before they had been consciously aware of its presence. Dr. Adams's investigation of the students' encounter led her to discover that similar sightings had been occurring at St. John's Church Cemetery for over a century, with remarkably consistent descriptions provided by witnesses from different time periods and backgrounds. Local families who had lived in Valle Crucis for generations shared stories that had been passed down through their families about encounters with the demon dog. And Dr. Adams found newspaper accounts and church records that documented sightings dating back to the 1890s. What made these accounts particularly compelling was their consistency across different witnesses and time periods. The creature was always described as an enormous black dog with glowing red eyes, always seen in or around the cemetery, and always inspiring the same intense fear and supernatural dread in those who encountered it. Witnesses consistently reported that the creature seemed to be guarding the cemetery, appearing most frequently when people visited the grounds after dark or when they showed disrespect for the sacred nature of the burial site. One particularly detailed account came from the family of Thomas Whitman, whose grandfather had served as caretaker of St. John's Church Cemetery in the early 1900s. According to family oral tradition, Whitman's grandfather had encountered the demon dog on multiple occasions during his years of caring for the cemetery grounds, and he had come to view the creature not as a threat, but as a supernatural guardian that helped protect the graves from vandalism and desecration. The grandfather reported that the creature would appear whenever strangers visited the cemetery with ill intentions, driving away those who came to steal from graves or damage headstones, while leaving respectful visitors unmolested. This protective aspect of the demon dog's behavior was confirmed by other witnesses who reported that the creature seemed to distinguish between different types of visitors to the cemetery. People who came to pay respects to deceased family members or to conduct legitimate research were generally left alone, while those who approached the cemetery with disrespectful or malicious intentions were more likely to encounter the creature and experience its terrifying presence. This selective behavior suggested that the demon dog possessed some form of supernatural intelligence that allowed it to judge the intentions and character of those who entered its domain. The Cherokee spiritual traditions associated with the Vale Crucis area provide additional context for understanding the demon dog phenomenon. According to Cherokee beliefs, certain locations serve as gateways or crossing points between the physical world and the spirit realm. And these places often attract guardian spirits that protect the boundary between worlds. The Cherokee concept of spirit dogs, or supernatural canines that serve as protectors of sacred sites, is well established in their oral traditions. And the appearance of such a creature at a location that was already considered spiritually significant would be consistent with their understanding of how the spirit world interacts with physical reality. The Christian interpretation of the demon dog phenomenon has varied considerably among different members of the local religious community. Some have viewed the creature as a demonic entity that represents the forces of evil attempting to corrupt or claim sacred ground, while others have interpreted it as a divine guardian sent to protect the cemetery and its inhabitants from harm. The creature's apparent ability to distinguish between respectful and disrespectful visitors has led some local Christians to view it as an instrument of divine justice rather than a manifestation of evil. Though its terrifying appearance and supernatural nature continue to inspire fear, even among those who believe it serves a protective purpose. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied the Vale Crucis demon dog have noted that the creature's behavior and characteristics are consistent with other supernatural guardian entities reported at sacred sites around the world. The combination of protective behavior, selective appearance, and terrifying supernatural abilities suggests that the creature may represent a type of spiritual phenomenon that transcends specific cultural or religious interpretations, manifesting in ways that are shaped by local beliefs and traditions, but serving a universal function as protector of sacred space. The psychological impact of demon dog encounters on witnesses has been consistently profound and lasting. People who have seen the creature report that the experience changes their understanding of reality and their relationship with the supernatural world. Many witnesses describe feeling as though they have been marked or chosen by their encounter, carrying with them a permanent awareness of the presence of forces beyond normal human experience. Some report that their encounter with the demon dog has strengthened their faith and their respect for sacred places, while others describe feeling haunted by the memory of those burning red eyes and the sense of otherworldly intelligence behind them. The photographic and physical evidence associated with demon dog encounters has been frustratingly elusive, with cameras frequently malfunctioning or producing images that are too unclear to provide definitive proof of the creature's existence. However, investigators have documented various forms of indirect evidence, including unexplained animal tracks that are too large to belong to any known species of dog or wolf, areas of disturbed ground around graves where the creature has been sighted, and electromagnetic anomalies detected by sensitive equipment in areas where encounters have occurred. The seasonal patterns of demon dog sightings suggest that the creature may be more active during certain times of the year, particularly around traditional times of spiritual significance such as Halloween, All Saints' Day, and the anniversary dates of significant deaths in the local community. Some researchers have noted that sightings tend to increase during periods when the cemetery is threatened by development, or when local spiritual traditions are being challenged or forgotten, suggesting that the creature's appearances may be connected to the need to protect and preserve the sacred nature of the site. Contemporary visitors to St. John's Church Cemetery continue to report encounters with the demon dog, though the creature seems to have become somewhat more elusive in recent decades as the area has become more developed and populated. However, those who visit the cemetery with respectful intentions and an awareness of its spiritual significance may still catch glimpses of glowing red eyes watching from the shadows among the headstones, or hear the echo of that otherworldly howl carrying across the valley on still mountain nights. The Valle Crucis demon dog represents one of the most enduring and well-documented supernatural guardians in Appalachian folklore, serving as a bridge between ancient Cherokee spiritual traditions and contemporary paranormal phenomena. Whether one views the creature as a literal supernatural entity, a manifestation of collective unconscious fears and beliefs, or something else entirely, its consistent presence at St. John's Church Cemetery over more than a century suggests that some places and some forces transcend our ordinary understanding of reality and continue to operate according to laws that are older and more mysterious than anything found in our modern world. For those who study the supernatural heritage of the Appalachian Mountains, the demon dog of Valle Crucis stands as a reminder that the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary, between the living and the dead, and between the natural and supernatural worlds remains permeable in certain places and under certain circumstances. The creature's role as guardian of sacred ground speaks to fundamental human needs for protection, respect, and reverence in the face of forces that are greater than ourselves. And its continued presence serves as both warning and comfort to those who understand that some mysteries are meant to be honored rather than solved. Moving to our 10th story, we venture onto the most famous hiking trail in America, a 2,190-mile pathway that winds through the spine of the Appalachian Mountains from Georgia to Maine, connecting some of the most remote and mysterious wilderness areas on the continent. The Appalachian Trail has been walked by millions of hikers seeking adventure, solitude, and connection with nature. But for some unfortunate souls, their journey along this ancient path has led them into encounters with something that defies all rational explanation. A presence that seems to stalk certain hikers with malevolent intelligence, leaving behind evidence of its passage that challenges everything we think we know about what lurks in the deep wilderness of these ancient mountains. The Appalachian Trail follows ridgelines and valleys that have been traveled by humans for thousands of years, first by Native American hunting parties and trading expeditions, then by European settlers pushing westward into the wilderness, and finally by modern hikers seeking to experience the raw beauty and challenge of America's oldest mountain range. The trail passes through some of the most remote and untouched wilderness areas in the eastern United States, places where cell phone coverage is non-existent, where the nearest road might be dozens of miles away, and where hikers can walk for days without encountering another human being. It is in these isolated stretches of trail, far from civilization and help, that the most disturbing encounters with the Appalachian Trail stalker have occurred. Mark Stevens has worked as a trail safety coordinator for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for over 15 years, a position that has given him access to thousands of incident reports, missing person cases, and unusual encounters reported by hikers along the trail's entire length. Stevens is a practical man who deals with tangible dangers, bear encounters, severe weather, medical emergencies, and the occasional criminal activity that can threaten trail users. However, his years of reviewing incident reports and investigating unusual occurrences have convinced him that there are patterns of activity along certain sections of the trail that cannot be explained by conventional wilderness hazards or human criminal behavior. According to Stevens and the extensive database of incident reports maintained by the Trail Conservancy, there are specific sections of the Appalachian Trail where hikers have reported being followed by an unseen presence, encountering disturbing messages and drawings left at campsites, and experiencing a sense of malevolent surveillance that seems to persist for days or even weeks as they continue their journey. These reports come from experienced hikers who are familiar with normal wilderness sounds and wildlife behavior. People who understand the difference between natural phenomena and something genuinely unusual or threatening. The pattern of stalking behavior typically begins subtly, with hikers reporting a vague sense of being watched or followed as they walk along isolated sections of trail. Initially, most hikers dismiss these feelings as natural paranoia or the psychological effects of spending extended time alone in the wilderness. However, as the stalking continues, the evidence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Hikers report hearing footsteps that seem to parallel their own movement through the forest, always staying just out of sight but maintaining pace with their progress along the trail. When they stop to listen, the footsteps stop as well. When they resume hiking, the sounds of pursuit resume with them. What makes these encounters particularly disturbing is the intelligence and persistence displayed by whatever is following these hikers. Unlike wildlife, which typically avoids human contact or follows predictable behavioral patterns, the Appalachian Trail stalker seems to study its targets, learning their habits and routines before making its presence known in increasingly obvious and threatening ways. Hikers report finding their campsites disturbed during the night, with gear moved or rearranged in ways that suggest careful examination rather than random animal interference. Food is sometimes taken, but not in the messy, destructive manner typical of bears or other wildlife. Instead, items are removed selectively and precisely, as if the stalker is sampling or studying the hiker's supplies. One of the most documented cases of Appalachian trail stalking occurred in 2018, when a solo hiker named Jennifer Walsh reported being followed for over 200 miles along sections of the trail in Virginia and West Virginia. Walsh was an experienced, long-distance hiker who had completed several major trails and was familiar with normal wilderness conditions and wildlife behavior. Her detailed journal entries, which she shared with trail authorities after her experience, provide a chilling day-by-day account of escalating stalking behavior that began as subtle unease and developed into overt psychological warfare. Walsh's ordeal began during her third day on a section hike through Shenandoah National Park, when she first noticed the feeling of being watched while hiking through a particularly remote stretch of trail. Initially, she attributed the sensation to natural wilderness paranoia, but as the day progressed, she began to notice signs that someone or something was indeed following her. She found footprints in muddy sections of trail that appeared shortly after she had passed. Prints that were too large and oddly shaped to belong to any known wildlife, but didn't quite match human footprints either. On her fourth night, Walsh made camp at a designated shelter area and was awakened around 2 a.m. by sounds of movement outside her tent. When she listened carefully, she could hear what sounded like someone or something moving slowly around her campsite, stopping occasionally as if examining her gear or studying her tent. The movement was too deliberate and careful to be wildlife. But when she called out to challenge what she assumed was another hiker, there was no response. The sounds continued for over an hour before finally stopping, leaving Walsh too frightened to leave her tent until daylight. The next morning, Walsh discovered that her campsite had indeed been visited during the night. Her hiking boots, which she had left outside her tent, had been moved several feet away and arranged in a precise pattern that seemed intentional rather than random. More disturbing still, she found a series of strange markings scratched into the dirt around her tent. Symbols or drawings that looked almost like primitive pictographs, but didn't match any Native American or historical markings she was familiar with. The drawings seemed to depict a human figure being followed or pursued by a larger, more ambiguous shape. As Walsh continued her hike over the following days, the stalking behavior escalated dramatically. She began finding more elaborate messages and drawings left at campsites and trail junctions, always appearing overnight or during periods when she had stopped to rest. The messages were disturbing in their specificity. Some included details about her hiking route that suggested her stalker had been observing her for days, while others contained personal information that should have been impossible for a stranger to know. One particularly chilling message, carved into a wooden trail sign, read, "Jennifer stops for water every 2.3 miles. A reference to her personal hiking rhythm that she had never shared with anyone. The psychological pressure of being constantly watched and followed began to take a severe toll on Walsh's mental state. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, jumping at normal forest sounds, and becoming increasingly paranoid about every shadow and movement in her peripheral vision. Sleep became nearly impossible, as she lay awake in her tent, listening for signs of her stalker's presence, and wondering what new message or threat she might find in the morning. The climax of Walsh's ordeal came on her 8th day of being stalked, when she discovered a message that demonstrated knowledge that no human stalker could possibly have possessed. Left at her campsite was a detailed drawing that depicted not only her exact location and the contents of her backpack, but also included a sketch of a tin container with a note that read, "This was the last thing Sarah ever saw." The reference to someone named Sarah was completely inexplicable. Walsh knew no one by that name, had never mentioned such a person in her journal or conversations, and could find no logical explanation for how her stalker could have known about anyone named Sarah. When Walsh reported this incident to trail authorities, Stevens and his team conducted an extensive investigation that included searching missing person databases for any hikers named Sarah who had disappeared along the Appalachian Trail. What they discovered was deeply disturbing. There was indeed a record of a hiker named Sarah Mitchell, who had vanished without a trace along the same section of trail where Walsh had been stalked. But Sarah's disappearance had occurred over 3 years earlier, and the case had never been solved. There was no way that Walsh could have known about Sarah's disappearance, as the case had received minimal media coverage and was not widely known, even among regular trail users. The investigation into Walsh's stalking experience revealed that similar incidents had been occurring along various sections of the Appalachian Trail for decades, with remarkably consistent patterns of behavior reported by different hikers in different time periods. The Trail Conservancy's incident database contained dozens of reports describing the same progression of stalking behavior. Initial feelings of being watched, discovery of disturbing messages and drawings, and escalating psychological pressure that often forced hikers to abandon their planned routes and seek help from trail authorities or local law enforcement. What made these cases particularly puzzling was the apparent knowledge displayed by the stalker about previous incidents and missing hikers. Multiple witnesses had reported finding messages that referenced people who had disappeared along the trail, sometimes including details about missing persons cases that were not widely known to the public. In some instances, the messages included information about hikers who had vanished decades earlier, suggesting that either the stalker had access to extensive historical records or represented some form of phenomenon that transcended normal human limitations of knowledge and memory. The physical evidence left by the Appalachian Trail stalker has been analyzed by various experts, including forensic specialists, anthropologists, and wildlife biologists. But no consensus has emerged about what type of entity could be responsible for the stalking behavior. The footprints found at stalking sites are consistently described as being larger than normal human prints, but not matching any known wildlife species. The markings and drawings left at campsites show a level of artistic sophistication and symbolic complexity that suggests intelligence. But the symbols themselves don't match any known human cultural traditions or writing systems. Some researchers have theorized that the Appalachian Trail stalker might represent a previously unknown species of primate or humanoid creature that has adapted to life in the remote wilderness areas along the trail. This theory is supported by the creature's apparent intelligence, its ability to move silently through dense forest, and its sophisticated understanding of human behavior and psychology. However, the stalker's knowledge of specific missing persons cases and its ability to leave messages that reference events from decades past suggest capabilities that go far beyond what could be expected from any known animal species. Other investigators have proposed that the stalking incidents might be the work of a highly organized group of individuals who have developed an extensive network of surveillance and communication along the trail. This theory could explain the stalker's knowledge of missing persons cases and its ability to track hikers across long distances. But it fails to account for the non-human footprints and the stalker's apparent ability to move through the wilderness without leaving normal human traces or requiring the logistical support that such an operation would require. The most disturbing theory, supported by some paranormal researchers and investigators of unexplained phenomena, is that the Appalachian Trail stalker represents some form of supernatural entity that feeds on fear and psychological distress. According to this interpretation, the stalker's behavior is designed not to physically harm its victims, but to create maximum psychological terror and emotional trauma. The references to missing hikers and the apparent knowledge of past disappearances could be explained as manifestations of some form of supernatural awareness that transcends normal temporal and spatial limitations. The psychological impact of Appalachian Trail stalking incidents on victims has been consistently severe and long-lasting. Hikers who have experienced stalking report that the encounters have fundamentally changed their relationship with wilderness areas and outdoor recreation. Many victims develop symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including persistent anxiety, sleep disturbances, and an inability to enjoy activities that previously brought them pleasure and fulfillment. Some stalking victims have never returned to long-distance hiking, while others report that they can no longer hike alone or in remote areas without experiencing overwhelming fear and paranoia. The Trail Conservancy has implemented various safety measures designed to reduce the risk of stalking incidents and provide support for hikers who report unusual encounters. These measures include improved communication systems that allow hikers to report incidents more quickly, increased ranger patrols in areas where stalking has been reported, and educational programs that help hikers recognize the signs of being followed or stalked. However, Stevens acknowledges that these conventional safety measures may be inadequate for dealing with a phenomenon that appears to operate outside the boundaries of normal human behavior and understanding. The geographic distribution of Appalachian Trail stalking incidents shows some interesting patterns that may provide clues about the nature of the phenomenon. Stalking reports are most common in the most remote and isolated sections of the trail, particularly in areas where the trail passes through old-growth forests or follows ancient Native American pathways. Some researchers have noted that stalking incidents seem to cluster around areas where the trail intersects with other unexplained phenomena, such as locations where cryptid sightings have been reported or where unusual disappearances have occurred. The seasonal patterns of stalking incidents also suggest that the phenomenon may be influenced by environmental or temporal factors that are not yet understood. Stalking reports are most common during the late fall and early winter months, when fewer hikers are on the trail and the forest canopy is bare, providing better visibility for surveillance. Some investigators have theorized that the stalker may be more active during these periods because the reduced hiker traffic makes it easier to focus on individual targets without interference from other trail users. The technological aspects of modern stalking incidents have raised additional questions about the nature of the phenomenon. Some hikers have reported that their electronic devices, including GPS units, cell phones, and digital cameras, malfunction or produce anomalous readings in areas where stalking has occurred. These electronic disturbances could indicate the presence of some form of electromagnetic phenomenon associated with the stalker, or they could represent deliberate interference designed to isolate victims and prevent them from documenting their experiences or calling for help. The cultural and historical context of the Appalachian Trail provides additional perspective on the stalking phenomenon. The trail follows routes that have been used by humans for thousands of years, including ancient Native American hunting and trading paths that connected distant tribes and communities. Some researchers have suggested that the stalking incidents might be connected to spiritual or supernatural forces associated with these ancient pathways, representing some form of guardian or protector spirit that has become corrupted or malevolent over time. The impact of Appalachian Trail stalking incidents on local communities along the trail has been significant, particularly in areas where multiple incidents have been reported. Local law enforcement agencies have had to develop new protocols for investigating reports of stalking that may involve non-human entities. And some communities have experienced economic impacts as fearful hikers avoid certain sections of trail or cancel planned hiking trips altogether. For those who study unexplained phenomena and supernatural encounters, the Appalachian Trail stalker represents one of the most complex and disturbing cases in the modern era. The combination of intelligent behavior, extensive knowledge of past events, and apparent supernatural abilities creates a phenomenon that challenges conventional understanding of what is possible in our world. Whether the stalker represents an unknown species, a supernatural entity, or something else entirely, its presence along America's most famous hiking trail serves as a reminder that even in our modern connected world, there are still mysteries lurking in the remote wilderness areas that defy explanation and continue to threaten those who venture too far from the safety of civilization. The ongoing nature of the Appalachian Trail stalking phenomenon means that new incidents continue to be reported, and researchers continue to gather evidence and develop theories about what might be responsible for these terrifying encounters. As more hikers venture onto the trail and technology improves our ability to document and analyze unusual incidents, we may eventually develop a better understanding of what stalks the ancient pathways of the Appalachian Mountains. Until then, the Appalachian Trail Stalker remains one of the most persistent and frightening mysteries of the American wilderness. A reminder that some shadows in the forest may be more than just tricks of light, and that some footsteps following behind us on the trail may belong to something that should not exist in our rational, ordered world. Moving to our final and perhaps most disturbing story, we enter the realm of documented supernatural possession and poltergeist activity that terrorized a mountain family in the early 1900s and attracted national attention from paranormal investigators, religious leaders, and even the wife of the famous magician Harry Houdini. The bouncing Bertha phenomenon represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of supernatural activity involving a child in American history. A case so extraordinary and well-witnessed that it challenged the skepticism of even the most hardened investigators and left an indelible mark on the field of paranormal research. Powell Mountain in Tennessee rises like a sleeping giant from the surrounding valleys, its forested slopes and rocky outcroppings creating a landscape that has remained largely unchanged since the Cherokee people first walked its ancient trails. In the early 1900s, this remote mountain was home to scattered families who eked out difficult lives from the unforgiving terrain, living in simple cabins and surviving through subsistence farming, hunting, and the occasional cash crop that could be sold in the distant towns below. It was in one of these isolated mountain cabins that a young girl named Bertha became the center of supernatural phenomena so violent and persistent that they would eventually attract investigators from across the United States and beyond. Bertha was described by those who knew her as a typical mountain child, hardy, resilient, and accustomed to the challenges of life in the remote Appalachian wilderness. She lived with her family in a modest log cabin that her father had built with his own hands, a structure that was solid and well constructed according to the traditional mountain building techniques that had served generations of settlers in the region. The cabin sat on a small clearing carved from the dense forest that covered Powell Mountain, surrounded by towering oak and hickory trees that provided both shelter and isolation from the outside world. The supernatural phenomena that would make Bertha famous began without warning on a cold February night in 1904, when the family was awakened by sounds of violent commotion coming from Bertha's small bedroom. When her parents rushed to investigate, they found their daughter's heavy oak bed, a massive piece of furniture that weighed over 200 pounds, bouncing completely off the floor with such force that it was striking the ceiling beams of the cabin. Bertha herself was lying on the bed, apparently asleep or unconscious, while the bed continued its violent bouncing motion, as if some invisible force was lifting and dropping it with tremendous strength. What made this initial incident so terrifying was not just the impossible nature of what the family was witnessing, but the fact that Bertha seemed to be completely unaware of what was happening around her. Even as the bed bounced and crashed with enough force to shake the entire cabin, the young girl remained motionless and unresponsive, as if she was somehow disconnected from the violent supernatural activity that centered around her. When her parents tried to wake her or remove her from the bouncing bed, they found that she was rigid and immovable, as if some supernatural force was holding her in place. The violent bed-bouncing phenomenon continued for 35 consecutive nights, creating a reign of terror that left the family exhausted, frightened, and desperate for help. Each night brought the same terrifying spectacle. Bertha's massive oak bed would begin bouncing with such violence that it would strike the ceiling, the walls, and sometimes even break through the wooden floor of the cabin. The sound of the bouncing bed could be heard for miles across the mountain, a rhythmic pounding that echoed through the valleys and alerted neighbors to the supernatural chaos that was consuming the family's home. Dr. James Morrison, a paranormal researcher at the University of Tennessee who has spent decades studying the Bouncing Bertha case, has access to original documentation and witness accounts that provide unprecedented detail about the phenomena. According to Dr. Morrison's research, the case attracted the attention of two University of Tennessee professors who initially traveled to Powell Mountain to debunk what they assumed was an elaborate hoax or case of mass hysteria. However, what these skeptical academics witnessed during their investigation was so disturbing and inexplicable that they fled the mountain cabin after just one night and later published contradictory reports about their experience. The professor's initial report, filed with the university administration, described witnessing phenomena that defied all rational explanation. They documented seeing Bertha's bed bouncing with such violence that it created cracks in the cabin's ceiling beams, while the young girl remained completely motionless and unresponsive throughout the ordeal. They measured the height of the bed's bouncing and calculated that the force required to lift the massive piece of furniture would have required the strength of several grown men. Yet there was no visible source of the energy that was causing the violent motion. What truly terrified the investigating professors, however, was their observation that Bertha herself was being thrown about by the same invisible force that was moving her bed. They watched in horror as the young girl was lifted completely off the bed and hurled against the walls of the cabin with such force that they feared for her life. Yet she showed no signs of injury or even awareness of what was happening to her. The professors described seeing Bertha's body contorted into impossible positions, twisted and bent in ways that should have caused severe injury or death. Yet she remained unconscious and apparently unharmed throughout the violent supernatural assault. The professor's second report, published several months later, attempted to rationalize their experience and suggested that what they had witnessed might have been the result of fraud, trickery, or psychological delusion. However, Dr. Morrison's research has revealed that this second report was written under pressure from university administrators who were concerned about the institution's reputation and wanted to distance themselves from claims of supernatural phenomena. Private letters and diary entries from the investigating professors, discovered years later, confirmed that they had indeed witnessed genuine supernatural activity and that their attempts to debunk the case had failed completely. Word of the Bouncing Bertha phenomenon spread rapidly throughout Tennessee and beyond, attracting visitors from across the United States who came to witness the supernatural spectacle for themselves. The remote mountain cabin became a destination for curiosity seekers, religious leaders, scientists, and paranormal investigators, all hoping to observe or explain the extraordinary phenomena that were tormenting the young girl and her family. Among the most notable visitors were representatives from major newspapers and magazines, who documented the case in detail and brought it to national attention. The phenomena were witnessed by hundreds of people during the 35-night period when they were at their most intense, including Baptist preachers, county officials, medical doctors, and other respected members of the community whose testimony could not be easily dismissed or discredited. These witnesses consistently reported seeing the same impossible events: Bertha's massive bed bouncing with tremendous violence, the young girl being thrown about by invisible forces, and supernatural manifestations that defied all known laws of physics and human understanding. One of the most significant aspects of the Bouncing Bertha case was the apparent connection between the supernatural phenomena and religious intervention, Multiple witnesses reported that the violent activity would sometimes calm or cease entirely when a Bible was placed under Bertha's pillow, suggesting that the phenomena had a spiritual or supernatural origin that could be influenced by religious objects or rituals. This observation led to numerous attempts by local ministers and religious leaders to exorcise or banish whatever force was tormenting the young girl, though most of these efforts provided only temporary relief. The most successful religious intervention came from a Baptist preacher who spent several nights at the cabin praying over Bertha and conducting religious ceremonies designed to drive away evil spirits. According to witness accounts, the preacher's efforts resulted in a dramatic reduction in the supernatural activity, though the phenomena never completely ceased during the 35-night period when they were at their peak intensity. The preacher himself reported feeling the presence of a malevolent spiritual force that seemed to be focused specifically on Bertha, and he described his efforts to help her as a spiritual battle between good and evil forces. The case attracted so much attention that plans were made for Bess Houdini, the wife of the famous magician Harry Houdini, to visit Powell Mountain and investigate the phenomena personally. Mrs. Houdini was known for her interest in spiritualism and supernatural phenomena, and her potential involvement in the case would have brought even greater national attention to the bouncing Bertha phenomenon. However, these plans were ultimately canceled when the supernatural activity began to diminish and eventually ceased entirely after the 35th night. The sudden end of the bouncing Bertha phenomena was as mysterious as their beginning. After 35 nights of violent supernatural activity that had terrorized the family and attracted national attention, the bouncing bed and associated manifestations simply stopped occurring, leaving behind only the physical damage to the cabin and the traumatic memories of those who had witnessed the extraordinary events. Bertha herself seemed to have no memory of what had happened during the nights when she was the center of supernatural activity, and she returned to normal childhood behavior as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. The long-term effects of the bouncing Bertha case on the family and community were profound and lasting. The family's cabin had been severely damaged by the violent supernatural activity, with cracked ceiling beams, damaged floors, and walls that had been weakened by the constant pounding of the bouncing bed. More significantly, the psychological trauma experienced by family members and witnesses created lasting impacts that affected the community for generations. Many of those who had witnessed the phenomena reported that the experience had fundamentally changed their understanding of reality and their beliefs about the supernatural world. Dr. Morrison's research has revealed that the bouncing Bertha case influenced the development of modern paranormal investigation techniques and established many of the protocols that are still used by researchers today. The case demonstrated the importance of having multiple credible witnesses, the value of detailed documentation and measurement of supernatural phenomena, and the need for careful analysis of the psychological and social factors that might influence such cases. The extensive witness testimony and documentation associated with the case have made it one of the most thoroughly studied examples of poltergeist activity in paranormal research literature. The scientific explanations that have been proposed for the bouncing Bertha phenomenon range from psychological theories involving unconscious psychokinetic abilities to more conventional explanations involving fraud or mass hysteria. However, none of these theories adequately account for the physical evidence of the case, including the documented damage to the cabin, the consistent testimony of hundreds of witnesses, and the apparent connection between the phenomena and religious intervention. The case remains one of the most challenging and inexplicable examples of supernatural activity in the historical record. Modern researchers who have studied the bouncing Bertha case note that it contains many elements that are consistent with other documented cases of poltergeist activity involving children and adolescents. The focus of the phenomena on a specific individual, the violent and destructive nature of the manifestations, and the apparent connection to psychological or emotional stress all fit established patterns in poltergeist research. However, the extreme intensity and duration of the bouncing Bertha phenomena, combined with the extensive witness testimony and documentation, make it one of the most significant cases in the field. The cultural and historical significance of the Bouncing Bertha case extends beyond its importance to paranormal research. The case occurred during a period when rural Appalachian communities were beginning to have more contact with the outside world, and the national attention that the phenomena attracted helped to shape public perceptions of mountain culture and supernatural beliefs. The case also illustrated the complex relationship between traditional religious beliefs and emerging scientific approaches to understanding unexplained phenomena. For the people who lived through the Bouncing Bertha phenomenon, the experience represented a confrontation with forces that challenged their understanding of the natural world and their place within it. The case demonstrated that even in the remote mountains of Tennessee, far from the centers of modern civilization, there could be encounters with the supernatural that demanded attention and respect from the wider world. The legacy of Bouncing Bertha continues to influence how people in Appalachian communities think about the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds, and the possibility that some phenomena transcend our ordinary understanding of reality. The Bouncing Bertha case stands as one of the most extraordinary and well-documented examples of supernatural phenomena in American history. A reminder that there are still mysteries in our world that defy explanation and challenge our assumptions about what is possible. Whether one believes in the literal truth of the supernatural events or seeks alternative explanations for what hundreds of witnesses reported seeing, the case remains a powerful testament to the enduring human fascination with the unknown and the unexplained. Call to action. And there you have it. 11 of the most terrifying, documented, and verified horror stories from the ancient mountains of Appalachia, each one backed by historical records, multiple witnesses, and evidence that continues to baffle investigators to this day. From the Bell Witch's supernatural murder to the Bouncing Bertha phenomenon that defied the laws of physics, these aren't just campfire tales or urban legends. These are real events that happen to real people in a region where the veil between our world and something far more sinister has always been dangerously thin. But this is just the beginning of our journey into the dark heart of America's most haunted region. At Verified Fears, we're committed to bringing you the most thoroughly researched and genuinely terrifying true horror stories that mainstream media refuses to touch. We dig deeper than anyone else. We investigate the cases that others are afraid to explore. And we bring you the documented truth about the supernatural forces that continue to shape our world in ways that most people never realize. If these stories have left you hungry for more verified terror, if you want to know about the cases we couldn't fit into this documentary, and if you're ready to discover the hidden horrors that lurk in every corner of America, then you need to subscribe to Verified Fears right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we're just getting started on this journey into documented darkness. Coming up next, we'll be investigating the haunted battlefields where Civil War soldiers still march in eternal formation, the cursed objects that destroy everyone who possesses them, and the government facilities where experiments went so wrong that they opened doorways to realms that should have remained forever sealed. We'll take you inside maximum security prisons where the dead refuse to serve their sentences. Explore the abandoned hospitals where patients still scream in empty corridors, and reveal the truth about the missing persons cases that connect to supernatural forces operating throughout America. Don't let fear keep you from the truth. Embrace it, because at Verified Fears, we believe that knowledge is power, even when that knowledge reveals the existence of forces that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. Subscribe now and become part of a community that isn't afraid to look into the darkness and document what stares back. Your next nightmare is waiting, and it's more real than you ever imagined. This is Verified Fears, where the truth is always more terrifying than fiction, and your journey into verified terror has only just begun.